Hello, everyone. Tonight I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes and let's begin. Story 1. The White Dress. The rain had been falling for 3 hours when Marcus saw her standing at the bend near mile marker 47, and even through the downpour and the sweep of his wipers, she was unmistakable. A young woman in a flowing white dress, thumb extended toward the highway like a beacon in the storm. Marcus had been driving these mountain roads for 15 years, hauling timber from the mills to the coast, learning every curve and pothole the way a sailor learns the constellations. He knew every place where fog liked to settle in the hollows, every stretch where black ice formed on winter mornings, every spot where deer would dart across the asphalt in the twilight hours. He also knew the stories that truckers told in diners and truck stops, passed down like folklore from driver to driver. But stories were just stories, entertainment to pass the long miles. And the woman looked real enough, hooked to the bone and shivering in the cold mountain air. He pulled over, air brakes hissing in the night like some great mechanical beast settling to rest. She climbed into the cab without a word, settling into the passenger seat with a soft rustle of wet fabric that seemed to echo in the confined space. Up close she was younger than he'd thought, maybe 25, with dark hair plastered to her skull and pale skin that seemed to glow in the dashboard lights with an otherworldly luminescence. Water dripped steadily from her dress onto the floor mat, creating a rhythmic patter that mixed with the sound of rain on the roof. There was something ethereal about her presence, as if she belonged to the storm itself, rather than the solid world of highways and truck stops. "Where are you headed?" Marcus asked, putting the rig back in gear and feeling the familiar weight of the loaded trailer behind him. The woman sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead through the windshield at the rain-slicked road that stretched into darkness. Water dripped steadily from her dress onto the floor mat, but she didn't seem cold anymore. Didn't seem to be breathing much either. Her stillness was unnatural, like a photograph that had somehow stepped into life but retained the frozen quality of a moment captured in time. "Home," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain drumming on the metal roof. "Just home." The word carried a weight of longing that seemed to fill the cab, a desperate yearning that made Marcus grip the wheel tighter. There was something in her tone that spoke of distances that couldn't be measured in miles, of destinations that existed beyond the reach of any highway map. Marcus nodded and pulled back onto the highway, his headlights cutting through the rain like pale swords. The woman continued to sit in perfect stillness, and as the miles passed, he found himself stealing glances at her. She never moved, never shifted position, never acknowledged the world rolling past outside the windows. It was as if she existed in a bubble of time separate from the rest of reality, untouched by the normal restlessness that affected every passenger he'd ever carried. "Rough night to be walking," Marcus said, trying to make conversation, needing to break the silence that was getting to him. The sound of his own voice seemed loud and intrusive in the quiet cab, but the alternative, sitting in silence with this strange, still woman, felt even more unsettling. She turned to look at him then, and her eyes were the color of winter fog, pale and distant, and filled with something that might have been sadness or acceptance or both. "I've been walking for a long time," she said, and something in her tone made Marcus grip the wheel tighter. The words carried implications he didn't want to consider, suggestions of journeys that had no beginning and might have no end. He glanced at the odometer, noting they'd been driving for 20 minutes through the winding mountain roads. The next town was Millfield, another 10 miles ahead, where an all-night diner served coffee strong enough to keep drivers alert through the longest hauls. He'd drop her there, let someone else worry about her story, her destination, the strange quality of stillness that surrounded her like fog. "You from around here?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer would be more complicated than a simple yes or no. The woman seemed to exist outside the normal geography of place and time, as if she belonged to the mountains themselves, rather than any particular town or address. She paused, tilting her head as if listening to something he couldn't hear, perhaps the wind through the trees, or the distant echo of memories that refused to fade. "Do you know what happened on this road?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Marcus felt his mouth go dry. Because he did know, of course. Everyone who drove this route knew about the accident 15 years ago. The tragedy that had marked this stretch of highway with invisible scars that seemed to draw the fog and make the curves more treacherous. A young woman driving too fast on a rainy night just like this one. Her car going off the road at mile marker 47, rolling down the embankment into the creek below. They'd found her 3 days later, when the storm finally passed and search teams could safely navigate the ravine. She'd been wearing a white wedding dress, had been driving to her own ceremony when the weather and the winding road conspired to end her story before it could truly begin. The details were burned into local memory, retold in newspaper archives and whispered conversations. How she'd been late for her wedding, how the dress had been perfectly preserved despite 3 days in the creek, how her fiancé had never married anyone else. "I don't," Marcus started to say, but when he looked over, the passenger seat was empty. Only a puddle of water remained, slowly spreading across the vinyl, like evidence of a presence that might have been real or might have been imagination. The silence in the cab was complete now, broken only by the rain and the steady rumble of the diesel engine carrying him through the night. Marcus pulled over again, hands shaking as he checked the cab, the sleeper berth, even crawling under the truck to look for any sign of where she might have gone. Nothing. The rain drummed on the roof like fingers tapping out an endless rhythm, and in the distance, he could see the lights of Millfield glowing through the storm like a promise of warmth and normalcy. He climbed back into the cab and reached for the radio to call dispatch, needing to hear another human voice, needing to anchor himself in the practical world of delivery schedules and road conditions. But as his hand touched the microphone, he glanced in the side mirror and saw her again, standing in the middle of the highway behind him, white dress billowing in the wind from passing cars like a flag of surrender. She was watching him drive away, her face serene and patient, as if she had all the time in the world to wait for the next driver who might stop, the next soul who might listen to her story of interrupted journeys and destinations that could never be reached. Marcus never stopped for hitchhikers again, but the experience had marked him in ways he couldn't explain. Sometimes, on rainy nights, when he passed mile marker 47, he would see her in his mirrors, still waiting, still walking that same stretch of road, looking for someone to take her home to a place that no longer existed in any form that the living could reach. He wondered, as all the other drivers who'd seen her wondered, what would happen if someone actually made it all the way to her destination, if anyone could bridge the gap between the world of the living and whatever realm she inhabited. He wasn't sure he wanted to find out, but the question haunted him through countless miles of midnight highways. A reminder that some passengers carried destinations that existed beyond any earthly map. Story 2, Last Stop, Fort Meridian. The soldier looked regulation from a distance. Crisp uniform, straight posture, thumb extended toward the interstate like a challenge to the indifferent night. Danny pulled his 18-wheeler over to the shoulder, hazards blinking in the pre-dawn darkness like the eyes of some mechanical creature pausing to examine this solitary figure. The man climbed into the cab with practiced efficiency, settling his duffel bag at his feet with the careful movements of someone who had packed and unpacked countless times. He was older than Danny had expected, maybe 50, with gray threading through his crew cut, and lines carved deep around his eyes like topographical maps of hard-earned experience. "Appreciate the ride," the soldier said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to military precision. Heading to Fort Meridian. Danny shifted gears and pulled back onto I-35, feeling the familiar weight of his cargo and the satisfaction of keeping schedule. "That's about 40 miles north. No problem." The soldier stared straight ahead, hands folded in his lap with military bearing, but something about his uniform nagged at Danny like a half-remembered song. The style looked off somehow, like something from an old war movie or a historical documentary, with details that seemed frozen in time from a different era. The soldier remained silent for several miles, watching the landscape roll past with the patient attention of someone who had traveled many roads and learned to find meaning in the journey itself. His uniform was perfect, every crease sharp, every button polished to mirror brightness, every detail maintained with a kind of obsessive care that spoke of deep institutional pride. But the perfection was part of what bothered Danny. It was too pristine, too unchanging, like a museum display that had somehow come to life and stepped onto the highway. "You stationed there long?" Danny asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them like fog in a valley. 23 years come December," the soldier replied, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, as if he were reciting information from a personnel file. "Started as a private, work your way up, you know how it is." Danny nodded, though he'd never served, his understanding of military life coming from movies and conversations with his brother before the accident that had taken him away from everything he'd planned to become. "What's your MOS?" Danny asked, using the military terminology his brother had taught him during their long conversations about service and duty and the different ways men found meaning in their lives. The soldier turned to look at him, and his eyes were the color of old photographs, faded gray, distant, as if they had seen things that belonged to another time entirely. "Supply logistics, making sure everyone has what they need." He paused, and in that silence Danny could hear the weight of responsibility, the burden of ensuring that others could do their jobs safely and effectively. "You ever been to Fort Meridian?" "Can't say I have. Don't usually make deliveries to military bases." Danny kept his eyes on the road, but he could feel the soldier's gaze on him, studying him with the intensity of someone evaluating a potential recruit or measuring the trustworthiness of a civilian. "Beautiful place. Old oak trees all around the perimeter. Barracks built in 1943. Red brick, real solid construction. They don't build them like that anymore." The soldier's voice carried a note of pride and nostalgia, the kind of deep affection that developed between a man and the place that had shaped his identity over decades of service. Danny made a non-committal sound, focusing on the mile markers that flicked by in the darkness like a countdown to some unknown destination. The soldier fell silent again, watching the highway roll past, but his presence filled the cab with an odd tension that Danny couldn't quite identify. There was something about his stillness, his perfection, his way of speaking about the base as if it existed in a perpetual present tense that made the hair on Danny's arms stand up. At mile marker 20, Danny's CB radio crackled to life with the familiar voice of another trucker heading south through the night. "Hey, northbound 18-wheeler, you're about to pass the old Fort Meridian exit. Watch for the turn. It's easy to miss in the dark." The casual warning carried an odd emphasis on the word old that made Danny glance at his passenger, who showed no reaction to the transmission. "Copy that," Danny replied into the microphone, his voice steady despite the growing unease that was settling in his stomach like cold coffee. "Appreciate the heads up," but something bothered him about what the southbound trucker had said, the way he'd emphasized Old Fort Meridian exit, as if the descriptor carried special significance that Danny was missing. The soldier shifted in his seat with the first sign of restlessness he'd shown since climbing into the cab. "Turn's coming up in about 5 miles, just past that cluster of billboards." His voice carried a note of anticipation, as if he were returning home after a long and difficult deployment. But there was also something else, a quality of urgency that seemed disproportionate to the simple act of getting back to base. Danny nodded, but his mind was working over the conversation on the CB radio, trying to understand why the other driver had felt the need to warn him about an exit that should have been clearly marked. "Tell me about the base," Danny said, needing to fill the silence that was growing heavier with each passing mile. "What's it like these days?" The soldier was quiet for a long moment, as if he were choosing his words carefully, or perhaps accessing memories that required extra effort to retrieve. Quiet. Real quiet. Most of the boys shipped out last month. Big deployment, you know. Iraq theater. His voice carried the weight of someone who had watched friends and colleagues disappear into the machinery of war, leaving behind empty bunks and unfinished conversations. Danny felt something cold settle in his stomach like a stone dropped into still water. Iraq? The question came out sharper than he'd intended, carrying implications that he wasn't ready to fully consider. Desert Storm. Whole division's been called up. The soldier's voice remained steady, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was speaking from a different timeline entirely, referencing events that belonged to a war that had ended more than a decade earlier. The turn signal for Fort Meridian appeared in Danny's headlights like a ghost, materializing from the darkness. A rusted sign pocked with bullet holes, weeds growing through cracks in the concrete like nature reclaiming abandoned territory. Below the exit sign, barely visible in the darkness and almost obscured by years of weather and neglect, another sign read, "Fort Meridian. Close 1995. The words hit Danny like a physical blow, confirming suspicions he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Danny's hands tightened on the wheel as the implications of what he was seeing began to sink in. He looked over at the soldier, who was staring out the window, at the approaching exit with an expression of homecoming that was both touching and deeply unsettling. There was no recognition in his face of the signs of abandonment and decay. No acknowledgement that the place he was so eager to reach had been empty for nearly 30 years. "This is me," the soldier said, gathering his duffel bag with the same practiced efficiency he'd shown when boarding. "Thanks for the ride." He opened the door and paused, looking back at Danny with those faded gray eyes that seemed to hold decades of unfinished business. "You take care now. And if you're ever back this way, stop by. We'll be here." He climbed down from the cab and walked toward the exit ramp, his boots crunching on gravel with a sound that seemed too loud in the pre-dawn quiet. Danny watched in his mirrors as the figure in the perfect uniform walked into the darkness, heading toward a base that had been closed for nearly 30 years, carrying a duffel bag full of belongings that belonged to a different era entirely. In the morning, Danny called his dispatcher and asked about Fort Meridian, needing to ground himself in facts and official records. The dispatcher laughed, a sound that carried no humor but rather the bitter amusement of someone who had heard too many strange stories from drivers who spent too much time alone on empty highways. "That old place? Been shut down since Clinton was in office. Nothing there now but concrete foundations and ghosts." But that night, when Danny drove the same route again, he saw lights flickering in the distance beyond the abandoned exit. Warm yellow lights in windows that shouldn't exist, in buildings that had been demolished decades ago. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the highway was empty enough to carry distant sounds, he swore he could hear the echo of marching feet and shouted orders, carrying across the empty fields where Fort Meridian used to stand like audio memories that refused to fade with time. Story 3. Sharp Smile. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, standing at the edge of the truck stop parking lot in clothes too big for his frame, looking like a scarecrow that had abandoned its post to wander the highways. Samantha had been driving for 6 hours straight, her next mandatory rest break still 4 hours away, but something about the kid made her pull over despite the tight schedule and the company's policies about unauthorized passengers. He had that hollow look she recognized from her own childhood, the look of someone who'd been walking for days, eating when they could find food, sleeping wherever seemed safe enough to close their eyes. He'd been that kid once, before trucking gave her away out of circumstances that had seemed as permanent as gravity. The memory of those desperate days was never far from her consciousness. a reminder of how quickly life could strip away security and force someone to depend on the kindness of strangers. She understood the particular vulnerability of being young and alone on roads that were built for adults, with destinations and resources, where a child became just another obstacle to be navigated around. "You need a ride, honey?" she called through the passenger window, her voice gentle but loud enough to carry over the rumble of idling engines and the hiss of air brakes. The boy nodded and climbed up into the cab with the careful movements of someone who had learned not to make sudden gestures that might change a potential benefactor's mind. He was thin, pale, with dark hair that needed cutting, and clothes that hung on his small frame like hand-me-downs from an older sibling who had long since outgrown them. When he smiled to thank her, Samantha felt her breath catch in her throat, and her hands tightened involuntarily on the steering wheel. His teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too pointed, filed to triangular points like a shark's mouth that belonged to something predatory rather than human. The smile lasted only a second, but the image burned into her mind like a camera flash, leaving after images that she couldn't blink away. It was the kind of detail that made her question what she'd actually seen, whether exhaustion and too many hours on the road had finally caught up with her perception of reality. "Where are you headed?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady while her mind processed what she'd seen, searching for rational explanations that would make the impossible seem merely unusual. "Just down the road," the boy said, his voice soft and younger than his eyes, which held a depth of experience that seemed inappropriate for someone who should have been worrying about homework and bicycle tires rather than survival on highways that stretched across endless distances. Samantha put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, feeling the familiar weight of her cargo and the responsibility of keeping schedule. The boy sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, staring out the windshield with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the mundane landscape rolling past. He didn't fidget the way kids usually didn't ask about the CB radio or the sleeper berth or any of the dozen things that normally fascinated young passengers who found themselves in the cab of a big rig for the first time. "What's your name?" Samantha asked, needing to break the silence that was growing heavier with each mile, needing to establish some kind of normal human connection that would push away the memory of those sharp teeth and the unnatural stillness that surrounded the boy like fog. "Michael." The boy turned to look at her, and for a moment his features seemed to shift in the dashboard lights, becoming something that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite child, wasn't quite anything that belonged in the normal world of truck stops and delivery schedules. "My mom's waiting for me." "That's good. She must be worried." Samantha heard the false cheer in her own voice, the kind of forced normalcy that adults used when talking to children about subjects too complex or frightening for honest discussion. "She's always worried." Michael's voice carried an odd note, almost amused, as if he found his mother's concern entertaining rather than touching. "She thinks something might happen to me out here." Samantha glanced at the boy again, noting how, in the dim light, his profile looked wrong somehow. Too angular, with shadows falling in places that didn't make sense according to the geometry of human faces. When he breathed, she could see the sharp outline of those filed teeth behind his lips, and each exhalation seemed to carry a sound like wind through broken glass. The wrongness of it made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to maintain the pretense of normalcy, to treat him like any other passenger who needed help getting from one place to another. "How long have you been traveling?" The question came out more pointed than she'd intended, carrying implications about supervision and safety that she wasn't sure she wanted to explore. "A while." Michael stretched, and his joints popped like an old man's, producing sounds that seemed too loud and too numerous for a child's body. "I don't get tired like I used to." The highway stretched ahead, empty except for the occasional set of taillights disappearing over hills, like red stars falling below the horizon. Samantha realized she hadn't passed another vehicle in 20 minutes, and her CB radio was silent. No chatter from other drivers, no distant music bleeding through the static, None of the constant communication that usually connected truckers across the vast network of highways that crisscrossed the continent. "Michael," she said carefully, choosing her words like someone navigating a minefield, "where exactly am I taking you?" The boy smiled again, and this time she saw all his teeth clearly. Dozens of them, each one filed to a perfect point that caught the light like polished bone. They weren't human teeth at all, she realized, but something designed for tearing and rending, for purposes that had nothing to do with normal childhood nutrition. "Just pull over up here, by those trees." Ahead, a grove of oak trees pressed close to the highway, their branches forming a tunnel of darkness that seemed to swallow light rather than simply blocking it. Samantha had driven this route 100 times and didn't remember the trees, but there they were, ancient and twisted, creating shadows that moved independently of any wind. "Here's good," Michael said as they entered the shadow of the branches, and Samantha pulled over, her hand shaking slightly on the wheel as the temperature in the cab seemed to drop 20 degrees. The boy gathered himself to leave, then paused with his hand on the door handle, looking back at her with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "Thank you for stopping," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "Most people don't, not anymore." "Your mother," Samantha began, but the words died in her throat as she realized how inadequate normal concerns seemed in the face of whatever she was actually dealing with. "She's not waiting," Michael said simply, his child's voice delivering adult truths with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had long since accepted realities too harsh for most people to acknowledge. "She stopped waiting a long time ago, but I keep looking for her anyway." "That's what children do." He opened the door and climbed down, then looked back up at her with an expression that might have been gratitude or hunger or something that transcended both human emotions. "But I keep looking for her anyway. That's what children do." He closed the door and walked away from the truck, heading deeper into the trees with steps that made no sound on the gravel, his small form seeming to fade rather than disappear behind the twisted trunks. Samantha sat in the cab for a long time after he was gone, engine idling, trying to make sense of what she'd seen and experienced. When she finally pulled back onto the highway, the trees were gone. In her mirrors, she could see only empty fields stretching toward the horizon, as if the grove had never existed, except as a way station for travelers who had nowhere else to go. The next morning, at a truck stop 3 states over, Samantha asked other drivers about the grove of oaks on Highway 82, describing the location and the strange encounter. None of them knew what she was talking about, but an old-timer named Jake bought her coffee and told her about the boy he'd picked up there 15 years ago. "Sharp teeth," he said, stirring sugar into his cup with the deliberate movements of someone who had learned to find comfort in small rituals. "Smiled like he was hungry for something." Jake shook his head, his weathered face reflecting years of highways and encounters that defied explanation. "Found out later, that stretch of road. They used to call it the Orphan Mile. Back in the 60s, there was a bus accident. 43 kids on their way to summer camp. All of them died in those trees." Samantha felt her coffee go cold in her hands as the implications of Jake's story settled over her like a shroud. "What happened to them?" "Buried in a mass grave about 10 miles from here, but folks say they never really left that road." Jake met her eyes across the table, his gaze carrying the weight of too many strange encounters and unexplained experiences. "They're still looking for their way home, still trying to get back to families that grieved and moved on decades ago." That night, Samantha took a different route, avoiding Highway 82 and the stretch of road where impossible trees created shadows that moved without wind. But sometimes, when she was tired and the highway seemed endless, she would see children standing at the roadside, always thin, always pale, always with that patient expression of someone who had been waiting far too long for a ride that would take them somewhere they could never actually reach. And she wondered what would happen if she stopped for all of them. If her truck could hold 43 lost souls, and if there was anywhere left in the world that would welcome them home to families who had long since learned to live with absence and grief that had no resolution. Story 4. Wet Steps. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the man standing by the overpass was still dripping. Water falling from his clothes in steady streams that darkened the asphalt in a perfect circle around his feet, like some kind of supernatural barrier. Carl could see the water falling even from a distance, creating patterns on the pavement that defied both the dry night air and any reasonable explanation for why a person would continue to shed moisture long after the storm had passed. It was 2 a.m., and Carl was making good time on his run from Phoenix to Denver, the highway empty except for the occasional semi heading the opposite direction, and the lonely figure that stood thumb extended toward the endless ribbon of asphalt. The man looked desperate, shoulders hunched against a cold that seemed to come from within, rather than from the desert air, and something about his posture spoke of someone who had been waiting far too long for help that might never come. Carl pulled over, air brakes sighing in the darkness like the mechanical breath of some sleeping giant, and watched as the man approached his truck with movements that seemed too fluid, too continuous, like water flowing rather than feet walking across solid ground. The man climbed into the passenger seat, bringing with him the smell of river water and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made Carl's nose wrinkle and his stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. He was middle-aged, wearing a business suit that had seen better days, with fabric that clung to his body as if it had never been dry. His hair was plastered to his skull, and droplets fell steadily from his fingers onto the floor mat, with a sound like a leaky faucet that had been running for years without repair. "Appreciate this," the man said, his voice thick and wet, as if he were speaking through water, or his lungs were filled with something other than air. "Car broke down about 10 miles back." Carl put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, feeling the familiar weight of his cargo and the satisfaction of making progress toward his destination. But something about his passenger disturbed him in ways he couldn't articulate. The constant dripping, the smell of stagnant water, the way the man's presence seemed to lower the temperature in the cab, despite the heater running at full capacity. "Where you headed?" Carl asked, trying to establish some kind of normal conversation that would push away the growing unease that was settling in his mind like fog in a valley. "Littleton. Got family there." The man's answers were short, functional, delivered without the casual elaboration that usually characterized conversations between strangers who found themselves sharing a small space for hours at a time. Carl nodded, recognizing the destination as a suburb of Denver, about 6 hours away through mountain passes and high desert plateau. "Long way to go. You want me to call someone for you? AAA maybe?" The practical suggestion seemed appropriate, the kind of normal assistance that one traveler offered another in times of mechanical difficulty. The man shook his head, sending spray across the passenger window like a wet dog shaking off water. "No need, just need to get home." The finality in his voice suggested that home was more than a geographical destination, that it represented something essential to his existence that couldn't be reached through normal channels of automotive assistance. They drove in silence for a while, passing through small desert towns, where the only lights came from all-night gas stations and the occasional truck stop that served as a beacon for travelers crossing the vast emptiness between major cities. Carl kept glancing at his passenger, bothered by the constant dripping that should have stopped by now, especially with the heater running full blast and the desert air as dry as parchment. The man's clothes should have started drying by now, should have shown some sign of responding to the warm air circulating through the cab, but water continued to fall from him like he just climbed out of a lake or river, as if his body had become a perpetual source of moisture that defied all natural laws about evaporation and atmospheric conditions. "Hell of a storm earlier," Carl said, trying to make conversation and hoping to learn something about his passenger's situation that would explain the ongoing wetness and the increasingly unpleasant smell that was filling the cab. "Yeah," The man stared straight ahead with eyes that reflected the dashboard lights like a nocturnal animal's. Hell of a storm. Your car flood out? Carl's question was logical, the kind of inquiry that would make sense if they were dealing with normal mechanical problems caused by weather issues. Something like that. The man's answers remained cryptically brief, offering no real information, while acknowledging Carl's attempts at conversation. Carl adjusted his mirrors and caught sight of something that made his heart skip a beat, and his hands tighten involuntarily on the steering wheel. The wet footprints the man had left when he climbed into the cab weren't drying either, weren't showing any sign of the normal evaporation that should have occurred in the warm, dry air of the truck's interior. If anything, they seemed to be getting wetter, spreading across the floor like spilled ink or some other substance that followed different rules about fluid dynamics and atmospheric pressure. "You okay?" Carl asked, his voice carrying a note of concern that was rapidly evolving into something closer to fear. "You're not hurt, are you?" The question seemed inadequate given what he was observing, but it was the kind of normal inquiry that people made when confronted with situations that didn't fit their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. The man turned to look at him, and Carl saw that his eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, lacking the clarity that should have come from someone who was alert and responding to immediate circumstances. "Do I look hurt?" The counter-question carried implications that Carl didn't want to explore, suggestions about the nature of injury and damage that might not be visible to casual observation. Carl wasn't sure how to answer that question because the man looked wrong in ways that went beyond simple physical injury. His skin was too pale, with a grayish tint that reminded Carl of things that had been underwater too long. And the smell was getting worse. Not just river water now, but something rotting underneath. Something that spoke of biological processes that should have been stopped by medical intervention or natural healing. "Maybe I should take you to a hospital," Carl said, the suggestion emerging from his growing conviction that whatever was wrong with his passenger required professional attention that went beyond simple transportation assistance. "Get you checked out." "No hospitals." The man's voice was sharp, carrying a note of panic or desperation that suggested hospitals represented something threatening rather than helpful. "Just Littleton, just home." The repetition emphasized the importance of reaching his destination, as if arrival at a specific geographical location would somehow resolve whatever was wrong with his condition. They passed a sign indicating Denver was 180 miles away, and Carl did the math in his head, calculating arrival times and trying to estimate how much longer he would have to endure the increasingly unsettling presence of his passenger. They'd been driving for over an hour, and the man was still dripping. The puddle on the floor had spread until it covered most of the passenger side, creating a small lake that sloshed with each turn and seemed to have a life of its own. "What's your name?" Carl asked, hoping that establishing a more personal connection might help him understand what he was dealing with, might provide some context for the strange circumstances that had brought them together on this empty highway in the middle of the night. Robert Morrison." The name was delivered with the same flat affect that had characterized all of the man's responses, but Carl thought he detected something else underneath, a note of surprise, as if the man had to think carefully before remembering his own identity. "You work in Denver, Robert?" Carl continued his attempt to establish normal conversational patterns to create some kind of framework that would make sense of what was happening in his truck. "Used to." Robert's breathing was shallow, labored, producing sounds that seemed to come from lungs filled with something other than air. "Had an office downtown. Insurance." Carl nodded, though something about the man's answers felt rehearsed, as if he were reciting information from a script rather than sharing personal experiences. The smell was making him nauseous now, and he cracked the window for fresh air, hoping that outside ventilation would provide some relief from the increasingly oppressive atmosphere inside the cab. At the next rest stop, Carl pulled over, needing a break from the strange circumstances and hoping that some time outside the truck would help him think more clearly about what he was experiencing. "I need to stretch my legs," he said, trying to sound casual despite the growing anxiety that was making his hands shake. "You want anything from the vending machines?" Robert shook his head without turning away from the windshield, maintaining his fixed stare at some point in the distance that only he could see. "I'll wait here." Carl climbed down from the cab and walked toward the building, but instead of going inside, he circled back to check on his passenger, driven by a combination of curiosity and growing concern about what he might discover. Through the windshield, he could see Robert sitting motionless in the seat, still dripping with mechanical consistency. But there was something else that made Carl's blood run cold. The water pooling on the floor was moving, flowing in patterns that had nothing to do with the truck's slight tilt or any natural force that should have affected standing liquid. It swirled and eddied like it was alive, forming shapes that looked almost like faces before dissolving again into formless wetness. Carl walked to the passenger side and looked up at Robert through the window, and what he saw made his knees weak and his vision blur around the edges. The man's head was tilted back, mouth slightly open, and water was flowing from his eyes like tears. Not dripping in the normal way that moisture accumulated and fell, but flowing in steady streams that ran down his cheeks and dripped from his jaw with the consistency of a faucet that had been turned on full force. Carl's phone had reception here, so he stepped away from the truck and quickly Googled Robert Morrison Littleton, his fingers shaking as he typed the search terms. What he found made his blood go cold and his stomach lurch with a combination of fear and impossible understanding. A newspaper article from 3 weeks ago carried the headline, "Local Insurance Executive Missing After Flash Flood." Robert Morrison, 52, of Littleton, Colorado, had been driving home from work when his car was caught in a sudden flash flood that had turned normally dry creek beds into raging torrents. His vehicle had been found submerged in Clear Creek, completely underwater, but his body was never recovered, despite extensive search efforts that had continued for days. The search had been called off after 5 days when it became clear that the current had likely carried his body far downstream, possibly into the South Platte River system, where recovery would be virtually impossible. Carl looked back at the truck, where Robert was waiting, and his passenger was watching him now through the window, and his expression had changed from the desperate, helpless look to something hungry and urgent, as if he understood that his secret had been discovered and time was running out. Carl's hand shook as he climbed back into the cab, and the smell hit him like a physical blow. Not just death and river mud now, but the sweet, cloying odor of decomposition mixed with the mineral smell of creek water and things that grew in dark underwater places where sunlight never penetrated. "Everything okay?" Robert asked, and his voice was different now too, deeper, with an echo that seemed to come from far away, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well or from some underwater cavern that existed beyond the reach of normal sound. "Fine," Carl managed, though his voice cracked on the single word. "Just fine." They drove through the night, and Robert never stopped dripping, never showed any sign that the constant flow of water from his body was anything other than normal. The water on the floor rose until it covered Carl's boots, cold and foul-smelling, carrying an oily film that reflected the dashboard lights in rainbow patterns that hurt to look at directly. When they passed other trucks heading in the opposite direction, Carl could see the drivers' faces illuminated in the light of their headlights, and he wanted desperately to signal for help, to somehow communicate the impossibility of his situation to someone who might understand, or offer assistance. But Robert was watching him constantly now, and those bloodshot eyes held a warning that went beyond simple threat. They promised consequences that Carl couldn't imagine but knew he didn't want to experience. As they approached Littleton in the pre-dawn hours, Robert began giving directions with the confidence of someone who knew every street and intersection intimately. "Turn here, go straight, turn left at the light." They ended up in an older residential neighborhood where trees lined quiet streets and houses sat dark with the sleep of ordinary people living ordinary lives that didn't include passengers who had been dead for weeks. "That one," Robert said, pointing to a small ranch house with a "for sale" sign planted in the yard like a flag of surrender. "That's home." Carl pulled over and Robert gathered himself to leave, moving with the same fluid motion that had characterized his entry into the truck hours earlier. But as he reached for the door handle, he paused and looked back at Carl with an expression that might have been gratitude or apology or something that transcended both human emotions. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from underwater caverns and places where the living were never meant to go. "It's hard being away from home so long. Being lost." He opened the door and climbed down, leaving behind a seat full of murky water that smelled like everything that had ever drowned in mountain streams. Carl watched him walk toward the dark house, noting how his footsteps left wet prints on the sidewalk that gleamed like oil in the streetlight. Robert reached the front door and simply walked through it, passing through the wood like it was made of mist or memory, disappearing into a house that had been empty since his disappearance weeks earlier. Carl sat in the truck for a long time, engine idling, staring at the empty house while water continued to drip from the passenger seat onto the floor. The "for sale" sign swayed in the wind and he could see water still pooling around his feet, evidence of a passenger who had needed to come home more than he had needed to acknowledge the fact of his own death. When he finally drove away, he caught a glimpse of light in the house's front window, a pale, cold light that seemed to move like water, shifting and flowing behind glass that should have reflected only darkness. And he thought he saw a figure standing there, watching him go, a silhouette that wavered like something seen through deep water or through the distortion of grief that refused to accept finality. The next morning, Carl called the real estate agent whose name was on the sign, needing to ground himself in facts and normal business transactions that belonged to the world of the living. The woman told him the house had been empty for months, ever since the owner disappeared in a flash flood that had shocked the entire community. The family couldn't bear to live there anymore, knowing he was still missing, still somewhere in the water system that had claimed him. "Strangest thing," she said, her voice carrying the puzzled tone of someone who had encountered phenomena that defied professional explanation. "Sometimes neighbors call to report lights in the windows, but when we check, there's no one there. Just water damage on the floors, like someone's been tracking in mud." Carl never told anyone about Robert Morrison and his impossible journey home, but sometimes, on rainy nights when he drove through Colorado, he would see figures standing by flooded roads, thumbs extended toward the highway with the patient desperation of those who had been waiting too long for rides that would take them to destinations they could never actually reach. And he wondered how many of them were trying to get home, to places that no longer wanted them, to families who had learned to live with absence and uncertainty, to houses that had become monuments to loss rather than shelters for the living. Story 5. The Empty Hood. The figure under the bridge had been standing there for 20 minutes, thumb extended toward the interstate with the patient persistence of someone who understood that help might be a long time coming. What bothered Jake wasn't the hitchhiker himself. He'd picked up plenty of people over his 30 years of trucking, had learned to read the difference between those who genuinely needed assistance and those who might represent danger or complications. What bothered him was the hood that completely obscured the figure's face, and more specifically, the way the fabric hung as if there was nothing underneath to support it, no human head or features to give it shape and substance. The man wore a heavy winter coat despite the mild weather, with the hood pulled up in a way that created deep shadows where a face should be visible. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the way the fabric draped and moved. It didn't curve over the normal contours of a human skull, didn't show the subtle variations in shape that indicated the presence of cheekbones, nose, or jaw beneath the material. Instead, it collapsed inward, as if the hood was empty, as if there was literally nothing inside to give it form or structure. Jake slowed his 18-wheeler and pulled onto the shoulder, his years of experience on the road having taught him to trust his instincts about people and situations, but also having instilled in him a sense of responsibility toward fellow travelers who found themselves stranded on highways that could be unforgiving to those without transportation. The figure approached the passenger side with an odd, gliding walk that barely disturbed the gravel beneath his feet, moving with a smoothness that seemed to defy the normal mechanics of human locomotion. "Need a ride?" Jake called through the window, his voice carrying the casual friendliness that characterized interactions between strangers who found themselves sharing the common experience of highway travel. The hooded figure nodded and climbed into the cab, and up close, the wrongness was even more pronounced, more impossible to ignore or rationalize. The hood cast a deep shadow where a face should be, but Jake could see nothing inside. Not darkness in the way that shadow normally appeared, not the suggestion of features obscured by poor lighting, but an empty void that seemed to swallow light rather than simply blocking it. "Where you headed?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady while his mind struggled to process what he was seeing, or more accurately, what he wasn't seeing. His years on the road had exposed him to all kinds of unusual people in strange circumstances, but nothing had prepared him for a passenger who appeared to have no face beneath his hood. "North," the figure said, and its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like sound echoing in an empty room, or reverberating through a cave system that extended beyond the reach of normal acoustic understanding. "Just north." The words seemed to originate from multiple points in space simultaneously, creating an effect that was deeply unsettling and suggested that whatever was speaking didn't rely on normal human vocal apparatus to produce sound. Jake put the truck in gear and pulled back onto I-75, feeling the familiar weight of his cargo and the comfort of routine mechanical actions that belonged to the normal world of schedules and destinations. The figure sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, hands folded in its lap, in a pose that might have seemed normal if not for the complete absence of features beneath the hood. The hands were normal enough, pale, thin fingers protruding from the coat sleeves, showing the kind of detail that made the absence of facial features even more jarring and inexplicable. "How far north?" Jake asked, hoping that normal conversation might somehow make the situation more manageable, might provide some framework for understanding what was happening in his truck. "I'll know when we get there." The response was cryptic, but delivered with a kind of certainty that suggested the passenger had a specific destination in mind, even if he couldn't or wouldn't articulate it in geographical terms that Jake could understand. They drove in silence through the Michigan countryside, past forests and farmland that rolled away from the highway in patterns that Jake had memorized over years of running the same routes. He kept stealing glances at his passenger, trying to understand what he was seeing, searching for some rational explanation that would make the impossible seem merely unusual. Sometimes, when the dashboard lights hit the hood just right, he thought he could see the faint outline of features, the curve of a cheek, the line of a nose. But when he looked directly, there was only that hungry darkness that seemed to draw his vision into itself like a black hole. After an hour of increasingly uncomfortable silence, Jake couldn't stand it anymore. The absence of normal human interaction, combined with the impossible nature of his passenger, had created a tension that was making his hands shake and his heart race with anxiety that had no specific focus, but seemed to permeate every aspect of his experience. "You okay under there? Are you sick or something?" The figure turned toward him, and Jake felt his blood freeze as the hood moved in a way that suggested there was a head inside it, complete with the normal range of human motion, but the shadow remained absolute, unchanged by the movement. There was no shift in the quality of darkness, no suggestion that the turning motion had revealed different angles or contours of facial features. "I'm fine," it said, the voice maintaining its impossible quality of coming from multiple directions simultaneously. "Just fine. You want some coffee? I got a thermos." Jake's offer was an attempt to establish some kind of normal human interaction, to create a routine that would ground both of them in the practical world of shared needs and simple courtesies. "No need." The response was flat, final, suggesting that whatever his passenger was, it didn't have normal human requirements for sustenance or comfort. They passed a sign indicating Flint was 50 miles away, and Jake found himself focusing on familiar landmarks and geographical markers that belonged to the world he understood, the world of truck stops and delivery schedules and conversations with dispatchers who dealt in practical concerns rather than impossible phenomena. He had driven this route countless times, hauling auto parts from Detroit to suppliers across the Midwest, and the familiarity of the journey should have been comforting. But tonight, the familiar highway felt different, longer, emptier, somehow removed from the normal flow of time and space that characterized his usual experience of travel. "You from around here?" Jake asked, continuing his attempt to establish some kind of meaningful communication with his passenger, to learn something that would help him understand what he was dealing with. "I was, long time ago." The figure's response carried a note of nostalgia or regret, the first emotional coloring that Jake had detected in its voice since it had entered his truck. "What brings you back?" The question seemed natural, the kind of inquiry that people made when trying to understand the motivations and circumstances that brought strangers together on highways that connected distant places and separated lives. "Unfinished business?" The phrase carried implications that Jake didn't want to explore, suggestions about purposes and obligations that transcended normal human concerns. Jake's CB radio crackled to life, interrupting the strange conversation with the familiar voice of another trucker heading south through the night. "Northbound 18-wheeler, you got your headlights on? Can't see you real clear." The transmission was routine, the kind of casual communication that helped drivers stay alert and aware of each other's presence on highways where visibility could be compromised by weather or mechanical problems. Jake frowned and checked his controls, confirming that his headlights were definitely functioning properly. He clicked the CB microphone and responded, "Lights are on down here. Maybe you got some fog." The practical explanation seemed reasonable, though he couldn't see any evidence of atmospheric conditions that would affect visibility. "Negative on the fog. You got a passenger with you?" The southbound trucker's question carried a note of curiosity that seemed disproportionate to the simple matter of vehicle visibility, and Jake felt a chill of premonition that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Jake glanced at the figure beside him, noting again the impossible absence beneath the hood, the way the passenger seemed to occupy space without actually existing in any normal sense. "Yeah? Why?" His response was cautious, uncertain about what the other driver might be seeing or not seeing. "Might want to take a look at your mirrors." The suggestion carried an ominous quality that made Jake's hands tighten on the steering wheel as he adjusted his side mirror to get a better view of his truck's exterior. What he saw made his heart stop, and his rational mind struggled to process information that violated every assumption he had about reality and perception. The cab appeared to be empty in the mirror's reflection. He could see the driver's seat clearly, could see his own hands on the wheel and his own reflection looking back at him. But the passenger seat looked vacant. Not empty in the way that an unused seat would appear, but vacant as if no one had ever sat there, as if the space itself rejected the possibility of occupation. "Are you seeing this?" the southbound trucker asked, his voice carrying a mixture of concern and bewilderment that suggested he was witnessing something that challenged his own understanding of how the world was supposed to work. "I see it," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the steady rumble of the diesel engine that carried them through the night toward destinations that might not exist in any normal sense. The figure turned toward him again, and this time Jake thought he glimpsed something inside the hood. Not a face, but the suggestion of one, like an image burned into his retinas by staring too long at bright lights. It was a sensation rather than a visual experience, an impression of features that existed in the space between perception and memory. "Is there a problem?" the figure asked, its voice maintaining the same impossible quality of coming from everywhere and nowhere, filling the cab with sound that seemed to have no source and no direction. Jake's hands were shaking on the wheel, and he could feel sweat beading on his forehead, despite the air conditioning that kept the cab at a comfortable temperature. "No problem." The lie came easily, driven by an instinct that suggested acknowledging the impossibility of his situation might somehow make it worse, might give whatever was sitting beside him permission to become even more unsettling than it already was. They drove through Flint without stopping, past Bay City and toward the straits that separated Michigan's two peninsulas, passing through familiar territory that should have been comforting but now felt alien and threatening. The figure never moved from its position, never shifted or adjusted its posture, but Jake could feel it watching him with senses that had nothing to do with eyes or normal human perception. The attention was constant and focused, like being observed by something that existed outside the normal parameters of human experience. As they approached the Mackinac Bridge, the massive suspension bridge that connected Michigan's lower and upper peninsulas, the figure spoke again with a finality that suggested their journey together was approaching its conclusion. "This is far enough." Jake pulled over at the rest area before the bridge, feeling relief at the prospect of ending this impossible encounter, of returning to the normal world of solo driving and rational passengers who cast reflections and had faces beneath their hoods. The figure gathered itself to leave, moving with the same fluid motion that had characterized its entry into the truck hours earlier. Before opening the door, it paused and turned toward Jake one final time. "Thank you for the ride," it said, its voice carrying what might have been gratitude if gratitude could exist in the absence of normal human emotion. "Not many people stop anymore." "Where will you go?" Jake asked, though he wasn't sure why the question seemed important, why he felt compelled to understand the destination of something that didn't seem to exist in any conventional sense. "Home, or what's left of it." The response carried implications about loss and change, about places that existed more in memory than in present reality. The figure opened the door and stepped down from the truck, and Jake watched it walk toward the bridge with movements that made no sound on the pavement, each step silent despite the solid surface that should have produced normal footfall sounds. At the pedestrian walkway that ran alongside the bridge's vehicle lanes, the figure paused and looked back at the truck, and for just a moment the hood fell back. What Jake saw underneath defied every assumption he had about the nature of existence and identity. There was nothing, absolutely nothing beneath the hood. Not emptiness in the way that space could be vacant, not darkness in the way that shadows fell, but a complete absence that his mind couldn't process or categorize. It was like looking at a hole cut in reality itself, a space where the normal rules of existence simply didn't apply, where the concept of presence had been surgically removed from the fabric of the world. The figure pulled the hood back up and continued walking, disappearing onto the bridge that stretched across the dark water of the straits like a ribbon of light connecting two worlds. Jake watched until it was completely gone, then sat in the cab for a long time, trying to steady his nerves and process what he had experienced. The normal sounds of highway traffic and the familiar vibration of his idling engine should have been comforting, but they felt distant and muted, as if he were experiencing them through glass or from underwater. The next morning he stopped at a truck stop in Escanaba and asked the waitress about the bridge, hoping that local knowledge might provide some context for his encounter. "You ever hear stories about that crossing? People seeing things?" The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s who had clearly spent years serving coffee to truckers and travelers, poured him more coffee with the practiced efficiency of someone who had heard every possible question about the local area. "You mean the Faceless Man? Oh, honey, that's an old one. Been stories about him for 40 years or more." Her casual acknowledgement of the phenomenon was both reassuring and deeply unsettling, confirming that Jake's experience was part of a larger pattern. while also suggesting that some things were beyond normal explanation or resolution. Faceless man? Jake's question carried a note of desperate curiosity, a need to understand what he had encountered and whether others had shared similar experiences. Started back in the 80s after that accident. Whole family driving north for vacation. Car went through the ice on the straits in a freak spring storm. They never found the father's body. She shook her head with the practiced sympathy of someone who had lived in the same place long enough to witness tragedy and its aftermath. Folks say he's still trying to get home, still trying to cross that bridge, but there's nothing left of him to go home to. Jake felt cold coffee settle in his stomach like a stone as the implications of her story began to connect with his own experience. What happened to his family? The question came from a need to understand the complete story, to find some framework that would make sense of the impossible encounter he had survived. Buried downstate, near Detroit, wife and kids are probably grandparents by now if they're still alive. The waitress wiped down the counter with movements that suggested she had told this story many times before, that it was part of the local folklore that she shared with curious travelers. Funny thing is, truckers keep reporting him. Always headed north, always trying to cross the straits, like he doesn't know there's nothing waiting for him on the other side. That afternoon, Jake called his dispatcher and requested routes that didn't take him through northern Michigan, offering no explanation for his sudden geographical preferences. Nobody asked for details, and he never volunteered them, but the experience had marked him in ways that would influence his choices for years to come. Sometimes, late at night when he was driving empty highways, he would think about the figure under the hood, about the complete absence where a face should have been, about the desperate need to reach destinations that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. And he would wonder what it was like to be so lost that you forgot you no longer had a face to show the world, so trapped by unfinished business that you continued traveling long after the purpose of your journey had been erased by time and circumstance. The faceless man was still out there, Jake knew, still trying to cross bridges that led to nowhere, still seeking a home that existed only in the space between memory and hope. Story 6, The Whispers Within. Maria had been driving long haul for 8 years, navigating the complex web of highways that connected distant cities and remote destinations. But she'd never picked up anyone like the pregnant woman standing at the truck stop entrance. The woman's belly was enormous, straining against a floral dress that had seen better days, stretching the fabric to its limits in a way that suggested her pregnancy was well advanced. She moved awkwardly, one hand pressed to her lower back, in the universal gesture of someone carrying weight that had grown beyond comfortable limits, while the other hand rested protectively on her swollen stomach as if shielding something precious from the harsh realities of the world. The truck stop was nearly empty at this hour, just a few scattered vehicles and the eternal glow of fluorescent lights that created islands of artificial daylight in the vast darkness of the highway system. There was no other vehicle near the entrance, no sign of how the woman had arrived at this remote location, no indication of what circumstances had brought a heavily pregnant woman to a truck stop in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was 30 miles back, accessible only by a winding access road that would have been difficult to navigate on foot, especially for someone in her condition. "Please," the woman said when Maria rolled down her window, her voice carrying the desperation of someone who had exhausted all other options and was depending on the kindness of strangers. "I need to get to Mercy Hospital in Bakersfield. My baby's coming." Maria looked around the parking lot again, searching for some explanation of how the woman had arrived here, but found only empty spaces and the distant hum of highway traffic that never completely stopped, even in the deepest hours of the night. "Where's your car?" Maria asked, the practical question emerging from years of experience that had taught her to be cautious about passengers whose circumstances didn't make immediate sense. "Broke down on the access road. Please, I don't have anyone else." The woman's plea carried a note of genuine distress that overrode Maria's instinctive caution about picking up strangers. especially strangers whose presence raised questions she couldn't immediately answer. Maria had helped deliver a baby once, during her earlier career as an EMT, before trucking became her chosen profession. She knew the signs of advanced labor, the particular way women moved when contractions were close together, the specific type of distress that indicated immediate medical attention was needed, the urgency that characterized true obstetric emergencies. This woman wasn't showing those signs. There were no contractions visible, no acute distress that suggested delivery was imminent, just the patient waiting and careful movement that marked the final weeks of pregnancy. But something about her desperation was real. Something about her need transcended normal explanations. "Get in," Maria said, making a decision that went against her usual protocols but felt necessary in the face of the woman's obvious need. The woman climbed awkwardly into the passenger seat, breathing heavily from the effort required to maneuver her bulk into the confined space of the truck cab. Her face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the kind of exhaustion that went beyond normal pregnancy fatigue. She settled her hands on her belly and sighed with relief, as if reaching this point in her journey represented a major accomplishment. Thank you so much." Her gratitude was immediate and profound, suggesting that Maria's assistance represented more than simple transportation. It was a lifeline, a connection to hope that might otherwise have been beyond her reach. Maria pulled back onto Highway 99, heading north toward Bakersfield through the San Joaquin Valley, past fields of almonds and cotton that stretched away from the highway in patterns that had been established by generations of agricultural development. "How far along are you?" Maria asked, making the kind of conversation that seemed appropriate when sharing space with someone in such an obviously vulnerable condition. 9 months, maybe a little more." The woman's voice was tired, carrying the weight of someone who had been dealing with discomfort and uncertainty for longer than seemed reasonable. "It feels like forever." "First baby." The question was natural, the kind of inquiry that established common ground between women who had shared or were sharing the experience of pregnancy and childbirth. The woman nodded, then winced slightly as something moved beneath the surface of her dress. "It moves so much at night. Sometimes I can barely sleep." As if summoned by her words, Maria saw the woman's dress shift as something moved beneath it, the fabric rippling and stretching in ways that indicated significant activity within the womb. The movement was more pronounced than normal fetal activity, more dramatic than the gentle kicks and shifts that characterized healthy pregnancy movement. The clear outline of a small limb pressed against the inside of the dress, creating a distortion that was both fascinating and slightly unsettling. "Active little one," Maria said, trying to maintain the casual tone that seemed appropriate for normal pregnancy conversation, though what she was observing seemed to go beyond normal fetal movement. "Very active." The woman rubbed her belly in slow circles, the kind of soothing motion that pregnant women use to calm restless babies, but her touch seemed to stimulate rather than quiet whatever was moving inside her. "Sometimes I think it's trying to tell me something." They drove through the San Joaquin Valley as the sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple in the dramatic display that characterized evenings in California's Central Valley. The landscape rolled past in familiar patterns. Agricultural fields, small towns, irrigation canals that reflected the changing light, like mirrors scattered across the earth. The woman dozed fitfully beside her, breathing shallow and irregular, occasionally stirring when the movement in her belly became particularly pronounced. An hour into the drive, Maria heard something that made her grip the wheel tighter and question her own perception of reality. It was whispering, soft, sibilant sounds that seemed to come from the passenger seat but not from the woman's mouth. The sounds had a rhythm and cadence that suggested communication, as if multiple voices were engaged in quiet conversation, but the source was clearly the rounded curve of the woman's belly rather than any normal human vocal apparatus. Maria tried to convince herself it was just the baby moving, air shifting in the womb, the kind of normal pregnancy sounds that medical professionals learn to recognize and interpret. But the whispers had a quality that transcended normal biological processes. They had rhythm and pattern, question and answer, back and forth communication in a language that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite anything that belonged to the normal world of obstetric care and fetal development. "Everything okay?" the woman asked, opening her eyes and looking at Maria with an expression that suggested she was aware of the driver's growing unease. "Fine," Maria said quickly, not wanting to acknowledge what she was hearing or suggest that anything unusual was happening. "Just checking my mirrors." The woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and the movement seemed to agitate whatever was inside her belly. "It's getting more active. The closer we get to the hospital, the more it moves." As she spoke, her belly rippled again with movement that was far more dramatic than anything Maria had witnessed during her EMT career, and she could swear she saw the outline of a tiny hand pressed against the inside of the woman's skin. But the hand had too many fingers, long and thin like spider legs, digits that moved with an articulation that suggested intelligence rather than simple reflex. The whispering grew louder as they continued north, becoming more distinct and urgent, as if whatever was communicating was responding to their approach to Bakersfield. Sometimes Maria could almost make out words, fragments of meaning in the sibilant sounds that seemed to carry implications about purposes and intentions that had nothing to do with normal human birth. But when she tried to focus on the sounds to understand what was being communicated, the meaning slipped away like smoke, leaving only the impression of intelligence, an agenda that transcended normal fetal development. "Do you hear that?" Maria asked, unable to maintain the pretense that nothing unusual was happening, needing some acknowledgement that the sounds were real and not a product of her imagination or fatigue. The woman looked confused, tilting her head as if listening for something she couldn't detect. "Hear what?" Maria stopped, realizing that the woman clearly couldn't hear the voices coming from her own belly, was unaware of the communication taking place literally inside her body. The implications of this disconnect were deeply unsettling, suggesting that whatever was happening was beyond the woman's conscious awareness or control. "Nothing. Thought I heard the radio." They passed through small farming towns, Pixley, Irlamart, Delano, communities that had grown up around agricultural development and remained connected to the rhythms of planting and harvest that had defined the valley for generations. The whispers never stopped, growing more urgent and insistent as they approached Bakersfield, sometimes developing into what sounded like argument or debate, multiple voices expressing different perspectives on subjects that remained beyond Maria's comprehension. The woman was getting more restless, shifting constantly in her seat, as if whatever was inside her had grown too large for the available space. "It knows," she said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of wonder mixed with apprehension. "Knows what?" Maria asked, though she suspected the answer would challenge her understanding of normal pregnancy and fetal development. "That we're almost there. It doesn't want to go to the hospital." The woman's voice was strained, suggesting that she was experiencing discomfort that went beyond normal pregnancy symptoms. "It wants to stay hidden." The word hidden carried implications that Maria didn't want to explore, suggestions about concealment and secrecy that had nothing to do with normal medical care. Maria felt cold despite the warm evening air that flowed through the truck's ventilation system. Why would it want to stay hidden? The question emerged from a growing sense that she was involved in something that transcended normal human experience, something that belonged to realms of possibility she had never considered. The woman turned to look at her, and her eyes were wide with something that might have been fear or wonder, or both emotions combined into a single expression of overwhelmed uncertainty. "Because it's not ready. It needs more time to grow, to become." The words carried implications about development and transformation that went far beyond normal fetal maturation. Become what? Maria's question was almost a whisper, emerging from a growing conviction that whatever was happening in her truck belonged to categories of experience that existed outside normal medical understanding. Before the woman could answer, her belly convulsed violently, the fabric of her dress stretching impossibly tight as multiple shapes moved underneath the surface. Not one baby, but many small things, writhing and coiling around each other like a nest of snakes or a cluster of sea creatures that had somehow taken up residence in human reproductive tissue. The whispering became a chorus, multiple voices speaking simultaneously in harmonies that created complex patterns of meaning that remained just beyond comprehension. Maria swerved slightly, fighting to maintain control of the truck while processing what she was witnessing, struggling to keep her focus on the practical task of driving while confronting phenomena that challenged every assumption she had about the nature of pregnancy and birth. "We need to get you to a hospital right now," Maria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone with medical training who recognized the signs of obstetric emergency. "No," the woman said, her voice suddenly different, deeper, carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "Not yet." "You're in labor," Maria began, but the woman was shaking her head with the certainty of someone who possessed knowledge that transcended normal medical categories. "I'm not in labor." The woman's hands pressed against her belly, and Maria could see something pressing back from the inside, multiple small shapes fighting against her palms, as if trying to break free from constraints that had become inadequate. "They're not ready to be born. They need more time to prepare." "They?" Maria's question carried all the implications of her growing understanding that whatever was happening transcended normal human reproduction, belonged to categories of biological possibility that existed outside standard medical knowledge. The woman smiled, and in the dashboard lights her teeth looked sharp, not the normal variations in dental structure that characterized human dentition, but deliberately pointed, filed to triangular shapes that suggested purposes beyond normal mastication. "My children, all of them." The phrase carried implications about multiplicity and intention that made Maria's hands shake on the steering wheel as she tried to process what she was witnessing. Maria's hands were trembling as she fought to maintain control of both the truck and her understanding of what was happening in the passenger seat. She could see the lights of Bakersfield ahead, the glow of the city against the night sky, like a promise of normalcy and medical assistance. But something told her that normal medical intervention might not be adequate for whatever was developing in the woman beside her. Mercy Hospital would have emergency services, doctors who could handle complicated births and obstetric emergencies, but this situation seemed to transcend the boundaries of normal medical practice. But the woman was shaking her head with increasing urgency, as if the approach to the city represented a threat rather than salvation. "Turn here," she said, pointing to an exit Maria had never noticed before, despite having driven this route countless times. The exit ramp appeared to lead away from the main thoroughfares, heading toward darker areas that existed on the periphery of urban development. "This way." "That's not the way to the hospital," Maria protested, her medical training insisting that proper obstetric care required facilities and expertise that could only be found in established medical centers. "I know where I need to go." The woman's voice carried a certainty that transcended normal human knowledge, suggesting that she possessed understanding about her condition and its requirements that went beyond standard medical advice. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and Maria realized with a shock of recognition that she could finally understand what was being communicated. The voices were speaking her name over and over in tiny sounds that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. "Maria! Maria! Maria!" The repetition was hypnotic and deeply unsettling, suggesting that whatever was inside the woman's belly had been aware of her identity all along, had perhaps specifically arranged for this encounter. They knew who she was. They knew she was listening. The implications of this awareness were staggering, suggesting a level of consciousness and intention that went far beyond normal fetal development. Whatever was preparing to be born had been observing, learning, making decisions about who would assist in their emergence into the world. The woman reached over and touched Maria's arm with fingers that felt too cold, too thin, possessing a quality of texture that suggested something other than normal human skin. Please, just a little further. They're so close now. The physical contact carried sensations that seemed to bypass normal nerve pathways, creating impressions of coldness and otherworldliness that made Maria's skin crawl with instinctive revulsion, against her better judgment, against every instinct that told her to head directly to the hospital. Maria took the exit. The decision felt like stepping across a threshold into territory that operated according to different rules, where normal medical protocols and rational decision-making might not apply. The road led away from the city lights, curving toward hills that looked black against the stars, terrain that seemed to exist outside the normal geography of developed California. "Here," the woman said finally, pointing to a grove of eucalyptus trees beside the road that created a natural amphitheater of shadows and whispered movement. "This is perfect." The location seemed to have been chosen for specific qualities: isolation, natural shelter, distance from human observation and intervention. It was the kind of place where things could happen without witnesses, where normal rules about birth and medical care could be suspended. Maria pulled over and the woman opened her door with movements that were becoming increasingly fluid and purposeful. As she climbed down from the cab, her belly pulsed and writhed with activity that was now impossible to mistake for normal fetal movement. In the dim light, Maria could see dozens of small shapes pressing against the thin fabric of her dress, each one distinct and apparently autonomous, each one with its own voice contributing to the chorus of whispers that had grown loud enough to be heard through the closed windows. "Thank you," the woman said, turning back to face Maria with an expression that combined gratitude with something that might have been anticipation or triumph. "You've been very kind." She walked toward the trees with steps that became more confident and purposeful with each movement, and with each step her belly grew larger and more active, as if proximity to the chosen location was triggering some kind of accelerated development. By the time she reached the grove, she looked ready to burst. Her dress stretched to impossible limits as whatever was inside her prepared for emergence. Maria sat in the truck, engine idling, watching the darkness between the trees where the woman had disappeared. She could still hear the whispers, even through the closed windows, growing fainter as the woman moved deeper into the grove, but never completely disappearing. Then, suddenly, there was silence. The complete absence of sound was more unsettling than the whispers had been, suggesting that whatever process had been building toward culmination had finally reached its conclusion. Maria waited for what felt like hours, but her clock showed only 20 minutes had passed, time seeming to operate according to different rules in this place removed from normal highway routine. Finally, she drove back to the highway and headed home. Radio turned up loud in an attempt to drown out the memory of those voices that had spoken her name with such intimate familiarity. The music seemed thin and artificial compared to the complex harmonies she had heard emerging from the woman's belly, but it provided some anchor to the normal world of human communication and understandable intention. The next morning, she called Mercy Hospital to inquire about any unusual admissions, hoping to learn something about the woman's fate and the outcome of whatever had transpired in the eucalyptus grove. No pregnant woman had been admitted the night before, the staff informed her. No one matching the description had even inquired about services or emergency care. It was as if the entire encounter had existed outside the normal systems of medical record-keeping and institutional memory. But a week later, Maria read about a discovery in the eucalyptus grove that made her hands shake as she held the newspaper. Dozens of small, hollow shells had been found scattered among the trees, structures that looked like discarded cocoons or the abandoned casings of some kind of metamorphic process. The police couldn't identify what had emerged from them, but the shells were clearly organic, showing evidence of having contained living tissue that had undergone some kind of transformation. The article mentioned that hikers in the area had reported hearing whispers in the wind, voices that seemed to carry on the breeze through the eucalyptus trees with a persistence that suggested intelligence rather than simple acoustic phenomena. Local authorities had investigated but found no evidence of human presence, no explanation for the sounds that multiple witnesses had described as resembling children's voices engaged in quiet conversation. And sometimes, late at night on Highway 99, Maria still heard them calling her name. The whispers would come through her radio speakers or seem to emanate from her cargo area, always just loud enough to be distinguishable from engine noise and road sounds, always carrying that quality of intimate recognition that suggested she had played a specific role in something larger than she could understand. She had been chosen, she realized, selected to assist in a process that transcended normal human reproduction, to serve as transportation for something that needed to reach a specific location at a specific time in order to complete a transformation that belonged to categories of biology that existed outside standard scientific understanding. The whispers were a reminder of her participation in that process, a connection to whatever had emerged from those cocoons and taken its first breaths in the darkness of the eucalyptus grove. Story 7. Final Mile. The old trucker stood at the on-ramp to I-80 with his thumb out, but something about him made Carl slow down before he even knew why. Some instinct developed over 30 years of highway driving that recognized when a situation didn't fit the normal patterns of roadside assistance and human interaction. The man was thin and weathered, wearing a company jacket that looked decades out of date, with styling and logos that belonged to an earlier era of trucking when regulations were different and the industry operated according to different economic and social principles. His rig was nowhere to be seen, which raised immediate questions about how an experienced trucker had ended up stranded without his vehicle, separated from the equipment that represented both livelihood and identity. Carl pulled his 18-wheeler over to the shoulder, following the unwritten code that had governed trucker behavior for generations. The understanding that drivers watched out for each other on the road, shared information about speed traps and weather conditions, provided assistance when breakdowns or emergencies left someone stranded far from help. This mutual support system had developed out of practical necessity, recognition that highways could be dangerous and isolating places, where survival often depended on the willingness of strangers to extend assistance to fellow travelers. The old man climbed into the passenger seat with a grateful nod, moving with the careful efficiency of someone whose body had been shaped by decades of physical labor and long hours behind the wheel. Up close, he looked to be in his 70s, with deep lines carved around his eyes by years of squinting into headlights and sunshine, and hands spotted with age and marked by the calluses and scars that came from working with heavy machinery and loading equipment. His jacket bore the logo of Hartwell Freight, a company Carl didn't recognize, despite his extensive knowledge of the trucking industry and its major players. "Much obliged," the old man said, settling back in the seat with the visible relief of someone who had been waiting longer than was comfortable for assistance that might not have come. "Name's Walter Kowalski." His voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had spent decades communicating over CB radios and in truck stop diners, accustomed to making himself understood over engine noise and across the cultural barriers that sometimes separated drivers from different regions and backgrounds. "Carl Morrison." "Where you headed, Walter?" Carl pulled back onto the interstate, feeling the familiar weight of his loaded trailer and the satisfaction of maintaining schedule while providing assistance to a fellow professional who had found himself in circumstances that required help. "Just need to get home. Been on the road too long." Walter's voice carried a particular kind of tiredness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness that came from years of repetitive travel and the gradual erosion of enthusiasm that could affect even the most dedicated drivers. 47 years I've been driving. Time for my last run." Carl nodded with understanding, recognizing the mixture of nostalgia and relief that characterized drivers who were approaching retirement after careers that had consumed most of their adult lives. "Retiring?" he asked, making the kind of conversation that established common ground between professionals who shared similar experiences and challenges. Something like that. Walter stared out the windshield at the Nebraska plains that stretched to the horizon under an enormous sky. Landscape that had remained essentially unchanged for generations, despite the constant passage of vehicles and the gradual development of towns and cities. You know how it is. Road gets in your blood, but eventually your blood gets thin. Can't drive forever. They drove through the familiar landscape of the Great Plains, past wheat fields and agricultural communities that had grown up around railroad lines and highway intersections, settlements that existed to serve the needs of transportation and commerce, that connected distant markets and population centers. Walter was quiet for long periods, then would suddenly speak up with observations about the highway, memories of where truck stops used to be located, how particular curves had been straightened and improved, changes that had accumulated over decades of traveling the same routes. "I remember when this was all two-lane," Walter said as they passed a construction zone where road crews were working to expand and improve a section of highway that had become inadequate for modern traffic volumes. You'd get stuck behind a combine harvester for 20 miles, nothing you could do about it except be patient and wait for a safe passing opportunity. Carl found Walter's reminiscences interesting, providing a perspective on highway development and industry changes that came from direct experience rather than historical documentation. "How long you been with Hartwell?" he asked, though something about the company name nagged at him. It seemed familiar in a way that suggested he should have been able to place it, but he couldn't recall any current operations or recent news about Hartwell Freight. Walter's expression grew distant, taking on the quality of someone accessing memories that required extra effort to retrieve clearly. "Started there in 1956, right out of high school. Mr. Hartwell hired me himself, taught me to drive the big rigs when I was still young enough to think I knew everything." His voice carried the affection and respect that developed between employees and employers who had worked together through good times and difficult periods, building relationships that transcended simple business transactions. Carl frowned, running through his mental catalog of trucking companies and industry history. He had been driving for 3 decades and knew most of the major freight companies, their reputations, their operational territories, their business practices, and safety records. Hartwell didn't ring any bells, which was unusual given his extensive knowledge of the industry and its major players. "They still operating?" he asked, hoping to learn more about a company that seemed to have escaped his attention despite Walter's obvious long-term association with the organization. "Not like they used to." Walter's voice carried a note of sadness that suggested he had witnessed the decline of something he had cared about deeply, had watched an organization that had defined his professional identity gradually lose its relevance and importance. Things change. Companies get bought out. Drivers retire or die off. Eventually, there's nothing left but memories and the occasional old-timer who remembers how things used to be. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of orange and red that reflected off the endless wheat fields, Walter started giving directions with the confidence of someone who knew the territory intimately. "Turn here, take this exit, go straight past the grain elevator." They were heading into rural Nebraska, away from the main highways Carl knew, following roads that led through agricultural territory that seemed removed from the major transportation corridor. "You sure about these directions?" Carl asked, noting that they were heading into farmland rather than toward any community large enough to support trucking operations or the infrastructure needed for freight terminals and maintenance facilities. "Looks like we're heading into the middle of nowhere." "I know the way," Walter's voice carried absolute certainty, the confidence of someone who had traveled these roads thousands of times under all kinds of weather conditions and circumstances. "Driven it more times than I can count, in every season, through every kind of weather you can imagine." They turned onto a gravel road that led past cornfields and abandoned farmhouses, structures that had once supported agricultural operations but had been left behind by changes in farming practices and rural economics. The road was in poor condition, full of potholes that made the truck bounce and sway, forcing Carl to slow to a crawl to avoid damaging his rig or losing control on the loose surface. "Much further?" he asked, growing concerned about the condition of the road and the isolated nature of their destination. "Not far now, just over that hill." Walter pointed ahead to a rise in the landscape that blocked their view of whatever lay beyond, his voice carrying the anticipation of someone who was finally approaching home after a long and difficult journey. As they crested the rise, Carl saw their destination and felt his understanding of the situation shift dramatically. An old truck terminal sat in the middle of the agricultural landscape, a large building surrounded by loading docks and parking areas that had clearly been designed to handle significant freight operations. But the facility looked like it had been abandoned for years, windows broken, weeds growing through cracks in the loading dock, paint faded and peeling from years of weather and neglect. A sign that had once announced Hartwell Freight Lines was barely visible, the letters faded to pink ghosts of their former red prominence. The entire facility had the desolate quality of infrastructure that had outlived its purpose, abandoned when economic conditions or business decisions had made continued operation impossible. "Walter, this place is closed," Carl said, stating the obvious while trying to understand why his passenger had directed him to a facility that had clearly been out of operation for years. The evidence of abandonment was overwhelming. No vehicles, no lights, no signs of human activity or maintenance. "I know," Walter gathered himself to leave, moving with the same deliberate care that had characterized his entry into the truck hours earlier. "But I still work here. Some of us never really left." His words carried implications about loyalty and dedication that transcended normal employment relationships, suggesting connections to place and purpose that survived organizational changes and business failures. He opened the door and stepped down from the cab, and in the fading light of evening, he looked somehow translucent, as if the act of returning to his workplace had begun some kind of transformation that was making him less solid, less anchored to the normal world of physical presence and material existence. "Thank you for the ride," Walter said, looking back at Carl with an expression that combined gratitude with something that might have been finality or resolution. "It means more than you know. Most drivers these days, they don't stop for an old-timer like me. People are too busy, too focused on their schedules to take time for courtesy and mutual assistance." "Walter, wait," Carl began, but the old man was already walking toward the terminal building with steps that made no sound on the gravel surface, moving with the purposeful stride of someone reporting for work despite the obvious impossibility of finding employment in an abandoned facility. At the loading dock, Walter simply walked through the boarded-up door, disappearing into the darkness inside as if the physical barriers that prevented normal entry didn't apply to him. Carl sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the abandoned building and trying to process what he had witnessed, attempting to reconcile the normal world of trucking schedules and business operations with the impossible experience of delivering a passenger to a workplace that no longer existed. Then he did something he'd never done before in all his years on the road. He got out of his truck and walked to the terminal entrance, driven by curiosity and a need to understand what had happened to Walter. The door was solid plywood, nailed shut with boards that hadn't been disturbed in years, sealed against weather and vandalism with the thoroughness that characterized long-term abandonment. But through gaps in the wood he could see light inside. Warm, yellow light from fluorescent fixtures that should have been disconnected decades ago. Illumination that suggested ongoing electrical service and human presence. And he could hear voices, the ordinary sounds of a working truck terminal, quiet conversation, the sound of paperwork being shuffled, the routine noises of administrative work and operational coordination. Occasionally he heard Walter's voice among the others, discussing route schedules and delivery times with the professional competence that had characterized his 47 years in the industry. The conversation sounded normal, routine, the kind of workplace discussion that took place in freight terminals across the country every day, but it was happening in a facility that had been closed for years. Carl returned to his truck and called his dispatcher on the satellite phone, needing to ground himself in the practical world of current business operations and verifiable information. "Hey Maria, can you look up something for me? A company called Hartwell Freight Lines, based in Nebraska." "Hold on." He could hear the familiar sound of typing as his dispatcher accessed industry databases and company records. Hartwell Freight, here it is. Went out of business in 1987. Looks like they operated primarily in the Midwest, small to medium freight operations serving agricultural communities and rural markets. "What happened to them?" Carl asked, though he suspected the answer would involve the kind of economic pressures and industry consolidation that had eliminated many smaller trucking companies over the years. Bought out by a larger company, then dissolved when the operations were integrated into existing routes and terminals. Says here the original owner, Thomas Hartwell, died in 1985, and operations ceased 2 years later when the family decided to sell rather than continue running the business. More typing provided additional details. "Why do you ask?" Carl looked back at the terminal building, where lights continued to glow in windows that should have been dark, and where voices continued the routine business of freight operations that had ended more than 3 decades earlier. "Just curious." "Thanks, Maria." He drove away from the terminal, taking the gravel road back to the highway and trying to understand what he had experienced. But in his mirrors he could see the building clearly. Not the abandoned wreck he had visited, but a fully operational truck terminal, with lights in every window and the silhouettes of trucks parked at the loading docks, equipment that belonged to an earlier era of trucking but seemed perfectly functional and ready for work. The next morning, Carl stopped at a truck stop in Grand Island and asked about Hartwell Freight, hoping to learn more about the company and its history from drivers who might have worked with them or remembered their operations. An old mechanic named Pete remembered them with the kind of nostalgic affection that characterized memories of better times and more personal business relationships. "Oh, sure, Hartwell. Good outfit back in the day." Old Tom Hartwell ran it like a family business, treated his drivers like relatives rather than employees, provided steady work, fair pay, equipment that was well maintained and reliable. Pete wiped his hands on a rag with the deliberate movements of someone who had performed the same action thousands of times over a long career. "Shame what happened to it." "The buyout?" Carl asked, though he suspected there was more to the story than simple business consolidation. Fields slept through the accident, lost 3 drivers in a winter pileup on I-80, including Walter Kowalski. He'd been with the company since it started, practically family to old Tom. Pete shook his head with the sadness that came from witnessing too many tragedies over the years. Old Tom never got over losing Walter and the others. Company folded pretty soon after, when his heart wasn't in the business anymore. Carl felt something cold settle in his stomach as the implications became clear. When was this accident? Oh, must have been 86, 87. Right around Christmas, if I remember correctly. Walter was making one last run before retiring. 47 years he'd been driving. Hell of a thing. Pete's expression carried the weight of personal loss, suggesting that he had known Walter personally and been affected by his death. They say he was less than 50 miles from home when it happened. Almost made it to the end of his career without a serious accident. That night, Carl took a different route back to I-80, avoiding the gravel roads and abandoned terminals that raised questions he wasn't prepared to answer. But sometimes, when he was driving through Nebraska and saw older men at highway on-ramps, he would think about Walter Kowalski and wonder how many other drivers were still trying to complete their final runs, still reporting to work at companies that existed only in memory, still following schedules that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond their control. The dedication that made someone a good trucker, the sense of responsibility, the commitment to completing assigned tasks, the professional pride that came from decades of reliable service, These qualities could apparently survive even death, creating obligations that transcended normal employment relationships and continued long after paychecks stopped and retirement benefits were no longer relevant. And he wondered how many ghost terminals existed along the highways he traveled, facilities that operated according to different rules about time and business continuity, where drivers who had given their lives to the profession continued to report for duty, still trying to complete one last run that would never actually end. Story 8. Empty Cargo. The woman with the baby carrier looked exhausted as she stood at the edge of the truck stop parking lot, and there was something about her posture, the way she held herself with the careful balance of someone carrying precious but fragile cargo, that made Dave pull his rig over. Despite the early hour and his tight delivery schedule, dawn was just breaking over the Virginia mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected off the morning fog, clinging to the valleys like cotton batting scattered across the landscape. She raised her hand tentatively when she saw his truck approaching, the gesture hesitant but desperate, suggesting someone who had been waiting longer than was comfortable but wasn't sure if help would actually materialize. Dave had been driving these mountain roads for 15 years, hauling everything from furniture to electronics along the winding highways that connected the industrial centers of the East Coast with the rural communities scattered throughout Appalachia. He knew the rhythms of these roads, understood which truck stops were safe for overnight parking, and which stretches of highway were prone to weather delays that could throw off carefully planned schedules. But he'd never seen anyone like this woman. Young, maybe mid-20s, with blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and the kind of exhaustion that went beyond normal fatigue. The baby carrier in her arms was one of those elaborate models with adjustable straps and extra padding, the kind of expensive equipment that suggested preparation and care, but it hung strangely in her grip, as if the weight distribution wasn't what it should have been. There was something about the way she held it that bothered Dave, though he couldn't immediately identify what seemed wrong about her posture or the carrier's position. "I need to get to Richmond," she said when Dave rolled down his window, her voice carrying the flat affect of someone who had moved beyond normal emotional responses into a state of mechanical functionality. "Please, I've been waiting here all night." The request was simple enough, but there was something in her tone that suggested the journey to Richmond represented more than simple transportation. It was a mission, a purpose that had consumed her attention and energy to the exclusion of everything else. Dave looked around the nearly empty parking lot, noting the absence of any broken-down vehicle or other explanation for how a young woman with a baby had ended up stranded at a remote truck stop in the Virginia mountains. There were no other cars, no signs of mechanical trouble, no indication of what circumstances had brought her to this place, or how long she had actually been waiting for assistance. "Where's your vehicle?" he asked, the practical question emerging from years of experience that had taught him to be cautious about passengers whose circumstances didn't make immediate sense, whose presence raised questions that couldn't be easily answered. "I don't have one anymore." Her voice remained flat, emotionless, as if she were discussing someone else's situation rather than her own circumstances. The response suggested loss or abandonment rather than simple mechanical failure, but she offered no elaboration or explanation for how she had become separated from her transportation. "Please, I have to get to Richmond for my baby." Dave had picked up stranded motorists before, though not often, and company policy generally discouraged giving rides to strangers who might represent liability issues or security risks. But sometimes basic human decency overruled corporate guidelines, especially when dealing with situations that involved children or obviously vulnerable people who needed assistance that couldn't be obtained through normal channels. "Get in," he said, making a decision based on instinct and compassion rather than strict adherence to company procedures. She climbed into the passenger seat with movements that seemed careful and deliberate, settling the carrier carefully on her lap with the kind of attention that suggested its contents were extremely fragile or valuable. Dave noticed she was wearing a hospital bracelet, though he couldn't read the details from his position behind the wheel, but the plastic band suggested recent medical treatment or institutional care. She held the carrier with both arms as if it contained something precious and delicate that required constant protection from the vibrations and movements associated with highway travel. Her attention was completely focused on maintaining the carrier's position and stability, showing the kind of hypervigilant concern that characterized new parents who were still learning to navigate the challenges of caring for vulnerable infants. "Thank you," she said, her gratitude immediate but delivered in the same flat tone that had characterized her initial request. "Thank you so much." Dave pulled back onto Highway 64, heading east toward Richmond, through the mountain passes that connected the rural communities of Western Virginia with the urban centers along the coast. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to establish normal conversational patterns that would help him understand more about his passenger and the circumstances that had brought them together. Susan Crawford." The name was delivered without elaboration, as if providing additional personal information required more energy than she possessed or was willing to expend on social interaction with a stranger. "Pretty baby," Dave said, glancing at the carrier and noting that through the small window in the front he could see what looked like a blanket, soft blue fabric that suggested careful preparation and attention to infant comfort. But there was no sign of an actual baby. No movement, no sounds, no indication that the carrier contained a living child who would require the kind of constant attention that characterized early parenthood. Susan's grip tightened on the carrier in response to his comment, her knuckles becoming white with the effort of maintaining her hold on something that seemed to have become the focal point of her entire existence. "Boy." "His name is Michael." Her voice caught slightly on the name, suggesting emotional significance that went beyond simple identification. "How old?" Dave asked, making the kind of casual conversation that people engaged in when discussing children, trying to establish common ground based on shared experiences or understanding of child development and parenting challenges. 3 weeks. Her voice carried a note of precision that suggested she had been counting days or hours with the obsessive attention that sometimes characterized new parents who were still adjusting to the dramatic changes that came with caring for infants. "He's very quiet. Sleeps most of the time." They drove through the mountain passes, past small communities and scenic overlooks that attracted tourists during peak seasons but remained largely empty during the early morning hours when most people were still asleep or just beginning their daily routines. Susan sat perfectly still, never adjusting her hold on the carrier, never checking on the baby inside, never responding to the sounds or movements that would normally prompt parental attention and intervention. Dave had been around enough new parents during his years on the road to know that this wasn't normal behavior. New mothers were constantly fussing over their babies, checking their breathing, adjusting blankets, responding to every tiny sound or movement with the hypervigilant attention that came from understanding how vulnerable infants could be. Susan showed none of these normal maternal behaviors, instead maintaining a rigid focus on simply holding the carrier without any indication that she was monitoring or caring for a living child. "He must be a good traveler," Dave said, making another attempt at normal conversation, while trying to understand why the baby was so consistently quiet and inactive. Most babies this age don't like car rides. The motion and engine noise usually either puts them to sleep or makes them fussy. "He's perfect." Susan's voice carried a dreamy quality, as if she were describing something that existed more in imagination than in immediate reality. "He never cries, never fusses. The nurses said they'd never seen such a quiet baby." The reference to nurses suggested a recent hospital experience which aligned with the medical bracelet she wore, but her description of the baby's behavior seemed to transcend normal variations in infant temperament. Dave felt something cold settle in his stomach, an instinctive response to information that didn't align with his understanding of how babies normally behaved, or how new mothers typically interacted with their children. You just come from the hospital?" Susan nodded, and he caught a glimpse of her bracelet, Richmond General, Maternity Ward. The identification provided context for her medical treatment and suggested that whatever had brought her to the truck stop was connected to recent childbirth and hospital care, but it didn't explain her current circumstances or the strange quality of her interaction with the baby carrier. "Everything go okay with the delivery?" Dave asked, hoping to learn more about the medical situation that had preceded her current journey, trying to understand whether complications or difficulties might explain her emotional state and unusual behavior. Susan was quiet for so long that Dave thought she wasn't going to answer, her silence stretching into minutes that suggested the question had touched on subjects too painful or complex for simple explanation. Then, finally, there were complications. The phrase was delivered with the kind of careful neutrality that people used when discussing traumatic experiences they weren't ready to fully acknowledge or process. Dave wanted to ask more, to understand what kind of complications she had experienced and how they might relate to her current situation, but something about her tone warned him away from pursuing details that might be too personal or painful for casual conversation between strangers. Instead, he focused on the road, noting how Susan never once looked down at the carrier in her arms, never checked on the baby, or made any of the small adjustments that would normally characterize a parent's interaction with an infant during travel. As they approached Richmond, Susan began giving directions with the confidence of someone who knew the area intimately. "Turn here, go straight, turn left at the light." They were heading toward an older residential neighborhood, tree-lined streets with modest houses and small yards that suggested working-class families and established communities that had developed over generations of stable residents. "That one," Susan said, pointing to a small bungalow with a neat front garden that showed evidence of careful maintenance and attention. "That's home." Dave pulled over, and Susan gathered the carrier to her chest with movements that had become increasingly protective and possessive during their journey together. As she moved, the blanket inside the carrier shifted slightly, and Dave caught a glimpse of what was underneath the blue fabric. The sight made his breath catch, and his understanding of the situation shift dramatically. The carrier was empty except for the carefully folded blanket, arranged around empty space in a way that suggested the presence of something that wasn't actually there. "Susan," Dave said gently, his voice carrying the careful tone that people used when dealing with situations that required delicate handling and compassionate understanding. "Do you want to talk about what happened?" She looked at him then, and her eyes were filled with a pain so deep and comprehensive that it made him want to look away, the kind of grief that seemed to encompass every aspect of human loss and disappointment. "He was so small," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the truck's idling engine. "Too small. The doctors said he couldn't, that he wouldn't." Her words trailed off into silence that carried more meaning than any explanation could have provided. Dave reached over and touched her hand with the gentle contact of someone who recognized suffering and wanted to provide whatever comfort was possible under impossible circumstances. "I'm sorry." The words were inadequate, but they represented the only response that seemed appropriate when confronting grief that transcended normal categories of loss and disappointment. "But I brought him home anyway." Susan's voice was barely audible, carrying the determination of someone who had made decisions that defied normal logic, but felt absolutely necessary for survival and emotional continuity. "I couldn't leave him there. He belongs with me." The statement revealed the depth of her attachment and the impossible nature of her situation. She was carrying home a baby who existed only in her need and imagination, cradling emptiness as if it contained everything that mattered. She opened the door and climbed down from the cab, holding the empty carrier like it contained the most precious thing in the world, moving with the careful attention that characterized parents protecting fragile infants from harm or disruption. Dave watched her walk toward the house, noting how she moved with deliberate care, as if afraid of jostling her invisible burden or disturbing sleep that couldn't actually be interrupted. At the front door, she paused and looked back at him with an expression that combined gratitude with something that might have been a plea for understanding or validation. "Thank you for believing," she said, her words carrying implications about the importance of having someone acknowledge her reality, even when that reality existed outside normal categories of truth and possibility. Most people can't see him anymore. Dave sat in his truck for a long time after she disappeared into the house, engine idling while he tried to process what he had witnessed and understand his role in a tragedy that involved loss beyond his ability to comprehend or address. Then he called his dispatcher and asked for a different route home, one that didn't take him past Richmond General Hospital or through neighborhoods where grief took forms that challenged his understanding of how people survived impossible losses. But that night he dreamed about empty baby carriers and the sound of crying that came from nowhere, phantom sounds that seemed to echo from places that existed between hope and reality. And when he woke, he could swear he heard Susan's voice on the wind, whispering lullabies to a child who would never grow up, singing comfort songs to emptiness that had been shaped by love into something that felt real enough to carry home. The next week, Dave saw a news story that made his hands shake as he read the details. Susan Crawford, 24, had been found in her Richmond home having overdosed on sleeping pills in what appeared to be a response to severe postpartum depression following the stillbirth of her son 3 weeks earlier. Police said she had been suffering from psychological complications related to the loss of her child, unable to accept the reality of his death or adjust to life without the baby she had carried for 9 months. The article mentioned that she was found holding an empty baby carrier and that neighbors had reported hearing a baby crying from her house for days after the infant's death. Sounds that had prompted several calls to social services and police wellness checks that found no evidence of a living child. But the autopsy confirmed what the hospital records already showed. Susan Crawford's son had never taken a breath outside the womb, had never experienced life in any form that could be measured by medical standards or recorded in birth certificates. Yet Dave knew what he had seen in that truck stop parking lot. A young mother desperate to get home to her baby, carrying love in a form so pure and powerful that it had created its own reality, shaped emptiness into something that felt substantial enough to hold and protect, and transport across the mountains to a home that was waiting for arrival that could never actually occur. And he wondered if love could be strong enough to give life to emptiness, to make something real out of nothing but hope and heartbreak, and the desperate need to complete a journey that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond human control or understanding. Sometimes, on his runs through Virginia, Dave would see other women with baby carriers standing at highway on-ramps, and he would think about stopping, about offering them rides to wherever they needed to go. But he never did, because some journeys were meant to be taken alone, even when the passenger you're carrying exists only in the space between love and loss, in the territory where hope becomes strong enough to create its own reality and carry it home to places that exist beyond the reach of normal maps and ordinary understanding. Story 9, Silent Tears. The teenager stood at the truck stop entrance like a statue, thumb extended toward the highway with the mechanical persistence of someone who had been waiting far longer than anyone should have to wait for help. But what made Linda break her 18-wheeler wasn't his position or his desperate expression. It was the blood. Red streaks ran from his eyes like tears, staining his pale cheeks and dripping onto his white t-shirt in patterns that suggested consistent flow rather than recent injury. But he wasn't moving to wipe them away, wasn't showing any sign that he felt the blood flowing down his face or was aware of the shocking nature of his appearance. Linda had been driving for 22 years, hauling pharmaceuticals from Atlanta to Chicago along routes that took her through every kind of weather and road condition. And she'd seen accidents, helped at crash scenes, provided first aid to injured drivers who had been hurt in rollovers or collisions that left them stranded, and bleeding on remote highways. She knew what trauma looked like, understood the difference between injuries that required immediate medical attention and those that could wait for proper professional care. But she'd never seen anything like this teenager who bled from his eyes without apparent awareness or distress. She pulled over and rolled down the passenger window, her years of experience in emergency situations overriding her instinctive caution about stopping for strangers whose circumstances might represent danger or complications. "You need an ambulance, honey?" The question emerged from her medical training and her recognition that bleeding from the eyes could indicate serious head trauma, brain injury, or other conditions that required immediate professional intervention. The boy shook his head with a gesture that sent droplets of blood flying in small arcs that caught the morning light like scattered rubies. But the movement was calm and deliberate rather than urgent or panicked. He looked to be about 17, with dark hair and features that would have been handsome if not for the constant stream of blood from his eyes, a flow that seemed to follow its own rules about volume and consistency, never varying in intensity or showing signs of clotting or natural healing processes. He pointed to himself, then to the highway, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed desperate need despite his apparent inability or unwillingness to speak. The communication was basic but effective, suggesting that whatever had happened to him had either damaged his ability to vocalize or created circumstances where speech had become impossible or inadvisable. "You can't talk?" Linda asked, trying to understand the nature of his condition and what kind of assistance he might need. The boy shook his head again and climbed into the cab with movements that were careful and controlled, showing no signs of the disorientation or instability that would normally accompany serious head injuries, or the kind of trauma that would cause bleeding from the eyes. Up close, the blood was even more disturbing, fresh and bright red, flowing steadily but not in quantities that should have killed him or caused the kind of blood loss that would result in shock or unconsciousness. There was no smell of iron or injury, none of the metallic odor that characterized normal blood, just the clean scent of rain and something else that she couldn't identify but that reminded her of sadness made manifest in physical form. Linda grabbed a box of tissues from her console and offered them to the boy, driven by practical concern and the natural impulse to help someone who was obviously in distress. "Here, let me help you with that." But when she reached toward his face with the tissues, the boy pulled back and shook his head violently, his eyes widening with something that might have been fear or desperation, as if her touch would somehow make his situation worse rather than better. He pointed to the road again, urgency clear in his gestures despite his inability to verbalize his needs or explain his circumstances. The movement was insistent, almost frantic, suggesting that reaching his destination was more important than addressing his medical condition or stopping the flow of blood that continued to stream down his face in steady rivulets. Okay, Linda said, recognizing that pushing him to accept medical attention might not be helpful under circumstances she didn't understand. "Where do you need to go?" The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, worn soft from handling and folded carefully as if it contained information too important to risk losing. On it was written an address in Macon, Georgia, in careful handwriting that looked like a child's careful attempt to create something important and permanent. "That's about 4 hours south," Linda said, calculating the distance and route modifications that would be required to deliver him to his destination. "I can get you part way there." The boy nodded gratefully and settled back in the seat, and Linda noticed that the blood continued to flow from his eyes with mechanical consistency, pooling on the floor mat at his feet in quantities that should have required medical attention, but seemed to cause him no distress or physical weakness. They drove through the Georgia countryside, past peach orchards and small farming communities that had grown up around agricultural development and transportation networks that connected rural producers with urban markets. The boy sat perfectly still, staring out the windshield with an expression of infinite sadness that seemed disproportionate to his apparent age, as if he had experienced losses and disappointments that belonged to a much longer and more difficult life. Every few minutes he would reach up as if to wipe his eyes, then stop himself mid-gesture, as if he'd forgotten that touching wouldn't help, or had learned through experience that attempting to stop the bleeding was futile. The motion was heartbreaking in its repetition and hopelessness, suggesting someone who had tried many times to address his condition without success. "What happened to you?" Linda asked, though she didn't expect an answer given his apparent inability to speak. The boy turned to look at her, and she saw intelligence in his eyes, along with a pain that seemed too deep and comprehensive for someone so young. The kind of suffering that suggested experiences no teenager should have to endure. He pointed to himself, then made a gesture like opening a book, his hands moving in a way that suggested he wanted to communicate something important, but was limited by his inability to speak and the constraints of nonverbal communication. "You want to tell me?" Linda asked, trying to interpret his gestures and understand what he was attempting to convey. He nodded and pulled out a small notebook and pen from another pocket, his handwriting shaky but legible as he carefully composed a message that would explain his circumstances. "I saw something I shouldn't have," he wrote, the words taking considerable time and effort to produce, as if the act of writing was difficult or painful for him. Linda felt her hands tighten on the wheel as the implications of his statement began to register. "What did you see?" She asked the question despite suspecting that the answer would involve circumstances too terrible for casual discussion, situations that belonged to categories of human experience that most people were fortunate enough to avoid. The boy wrote for a long time before showing her the paper, his handwriting becoming increasingly unsteady as he recorded details that were obviously difficult to revisit. "My stepfather, what he did to my little sister. I was going to tell, but he found out." The words revealed a situation that involved child abuse and family violence, circumstances that explained both his current condition and his desperate need to reach his destination. The blood from his eyes seemed to flow faster as he wrote, dripping steadily onto the notebook pages and creating stains that made his words even more difficult to read. Linda's stomach clenched as she realized she was dealing with a situation that involved serious criminal activity and family trauma that had escalated into circumstances requiring immediate intervention and protection. "Did he hurt you?" Linda asked, her voice carrying the careful tone that people used when discussing sensitive subjects that might involve ongoing danger or legal complications. The boy nodded and wrote, "He said if I ever told anyone, I'd cry blood until the day I died. I thought he was just trying to scare me." The statement revealed both the supernatural nature of his condition and the criminal activity that had precipitated it, suggesting that his stepfather had somehow caused the bleeding through methods that transcended normal human capabilities. "When did this start?" Linda asked, trying to understand the timeline and circumstances that had led to his current situation. 2 days ago, right after." The boy's handwriting trailed off, and he didn't need to finish the sentence for Linda to understand what had happened. The timing suggested that his sister's abuse had reached a crisis point 3 days earlier, and that whatever his stepfather had done to punish his intended testimony had begun at that time. Linda didn't need him to finish because she'd hauled enough loads through small towns, had seen enough missing child posters, and heard enough tragic news stories to understand the implications of what he was describing. "Where's your little sister now?" she asked, hoping that the child was safe and that the situation had been resolved in a way that protected the innocent. The boy wrote, "Safe, with my aunt in Macon. That's where I'm going." The response provided context for his destination and suggested that some kind of protective action had been taken, that at least one member of the family had found safety despite the terrible circumstances that had preceded their escape. "And your stepfather?" Linda asked. though she suspected she knew the answer, based on the boy's demeanor and the finality that seemed to characterize his current situation. The boy's expression darkened, and he wrote slowly, "Can't hurt anyone anymore." The statement suggested that whatever had happened 3 days earlier had resulted in permanent resolution of the threat, though the methods and circumstances remained unclear. They drove in silence for a while, Linda processing the implications of what she had learned, while the boy seemed exhausted by the effort of communicating his story through written words and gestures. The blood never stopped flowing, and she noticed it was starting to stain the passenger seat with a persistence that defied normal cleaning or removal. But there was something about the blood that bothered her beyond its impossible persistence and supernatural origin. It was too bright, too red, lacking the darkening that characterized normal blood as it oxidized and aged. It looked more like paint than biological fluid, as if it were a symbolic representation of blood rather than the actual substance, a visual manifestation of grief and trauma rather than evidence of physical injury. As they approached Macon, the boy began pointing out directions with increasing animation and purpose. "Turn here, straight for 2 miles, left at the church." They ended up in a quiet residential neighborhood. Older homes with wide porches and mature trees that suggested stability and community. The kind of place where children could play safely and families could establish roots that lasted for generations. "That one," the boy wrote, pointing to a small house with yellow siding and a front yard that showed evidence of careful maintenance and attention. "My aunt's." Linda pulled over and the boy gathered his few belongings, preparing to leave the truck that had carried him across state lines to safety and family members who would provide protection and care. Before he opened the door, he wrote one more note. "Thank you. Most people won't stop when they see the blood." The message revealed both his awareness of how frightening his appearance must be and his gratitude for Linda's willingness to provide assistance, despite the shocking and supernatural nature of his condition. "Will you be okay?" Linda asked, though she wasn't sure what kind of recovery was possible for someone whose condition seemed to transcend normal medical categories and treatment options. The boy shrugged and wrote, "The blood won't stop, but at least I'm not scared anymore." The response suggested acceptance of his condition, while acknowledging that reaching safety and family had provided some kind of peace, despite the ongoing supernatural consequences of his testimony. He climbed down from the cab and walked toward the house with movements that seemed older and more deliberate than his apparent age would suggest, as if his experiences had aged him beyond his chronological years. At the front door, he paused and looked back at her, and even from a distance she could see the bright red tears on his cheeks, impossible blood that continued to flow as evidence of trauma that couldn't be healed through normal means. The door opened before he could knock, and a woman appeared, middle-aged, with kind eyes and graying hair that suggested wisdom and experience. She gathered the boy into her arms without hesitation, seeming not to notice or care about the blood that would inevitably stain her clothes and hands. Linda heard her voice carry across the yard. "Oh, honey, you made it. You're safe now." Linda drove away, but something nagged at her about the encounter. Something about the boy's story and the supernatural nature of his condition that seemed to connect to larger patterns of justice and consequence that operated according to different rules than normal human law enforcement. That evening, she stopped at a truck stop with Wi-Fi and searched for news from the area where she'd picked up the boy. The story was 3 days old, matching the timeline the boy had provided. Local man found dead in apparent suicide. The article described how James Morrison, 45, had been found hanging in his garage after allegations of child abuse had surfaced, accusations that had apparently driven him to take his own life rather than face legal consequences and social disgrace. His stepson, David Morrison, 17, had been missing since the discovery of the body. There was a photo of David Morrison with the article, showing the same dark hair and facial features as her passenger. But in the newspaper image, he was smiling, his eyes bright and clear, showing no sign of the blood that had characterized his appearance during their journey together. The contrast between the normal teenager in the photograph and the supernaturally afflicted boy she had transported was stark and disturbing. Linda scrolled through more articles and found the follow-up story that made her hands shake as she read the details. Missing teen found dead. David Morrison's body had been discovered in a creek about 10 miles from his home, and the medical examiner estimated he'd been dead for at least 2 days, which meant he'd been dead when Linda picked him up at the truck stop. Had been a ghost or a spirit seeking transportation to complete unfinished business, rather than a living teenager in need of medical attention. But there was something else in the article that made her question the nature of reality and the boundaries between life and death. David's aunt in Macon confirmed that she'd been expecting him to arrive soon, that she'd been waiting for him to come live with her after the tragedy involving his stepfather and the revelations about abuse that had torn the family apart. "He called me the night before he died," the aunt was quoted as saying, her words suggesting communication that had occurred after his death if the medical examiner's timeline was accurate. "He said he was going to make sure his little sister was safe, no matter what it cost him. He said he'd find a way to get to me, even if he had to walk through hell to do it." Linda closed her laptop and sat in the truck stop parking lot for a long time, processing what she had learned and trying to understand her role in facilitating a journey that had apparently involved supernatural transportation of a dead teenager who had needed to complete a promise made to protect his sister. She thought about the boy's expression, that infinite sadness in his eyes that now made sense as the grief of someone who had died trying to save someone he loved. And she thought about what he'd written. "The blood won't stop, but at least I'm not scared anymore." The statement took on new meaning when considered as the words of someone who had already faced the worst possible outcome and found peace in knowing that his sacrifice had achieved its purpose, that his testimony had stopped his stepfather and saved his sister, even though it had cost him his life. In the years that followed, Linda heard stories from other drivers about a bleeding boy who appeared at truck stops throughout Georgia, always silent, always heading toward Macon, always leaving behind the faint scent of rain and the memory of eyes filled with ancient sadness. The encounters followed a pattern. Drivers would pick up a teenager bleeding from his eyes, transport him partway to his destination, and later discover that they had provided assistance to someone who had been dead for years. And she wondered if he was still traveling that road, still trying to keep a promise he'd made to protect his sister, still carrying guilt that belonged to someone else, and crying tears of blood for sins that weren't his own. The dead, Linda learned, didn't always rest easy when they left behind people they needed to protect, obligations they hadn't finished, promises they hadn't kept. Sometimes they continued their journeys long after their bodies had given up, powered by love and determination that transcended normal biological limitations, carrying their stories to anyone willing to listen and provide transportation to destinations that existed beyond normal geographical boundaries. Story 10. Shadow Play. Tom noticed the shadow before he noticed the man, and the wrongness of it made him slow his 18-wheeler and pull over, despite every instinct that told him to keep driving and avoid whatever impossible situation was developing beside Highway 50 in the bright Nevada desert sun. The shadow was moving east, while the figure casting it walked west along the shoulder, creating a contradiction that violated basic laws of physics and optics that had governed Tom's understanding of reality for his entire adult life. In the harsh desert light that should have created clear, predictable shadows, this one stretched across the asphalt like a dark finger pointing in the opposite direction from its source, moving independently according to its own agenda and purpose. The man at the roadside appeared ordinary enough, middle-aged, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt despite the desert heat, thumb extended toward the highway with the patient persistence of someone who understood that help might be a long time coming in this isolated stretch of Nevada backcountry, but his shadow preceded him as he approached Tom's truck, reaching the passenger door several seconds before the man himself arrived, moving with a fluidity and independence that suggested it operated according to different rules than normal optical phenomena. "Need a ride?" Tom called through the passenger window, though he was already regretting his decision to stop, already feeling the familiar tingle of apprehension that had kept him alive through 30 years of highway driving and encounters with situations that didn't fit normal categories of roadside assistance. The man approached the truck with a grateful smile, moving with the unhurried gait of someone who had been walking for a long time and was relieved to find transportation. "Appreciate it," the man said, climbing into the passenger seat with movements that seemed normal enough, though Tom noticed that his shadow in the passenger window was facing the wrong direction, looking back toward where they'd come from instead of forward with its owner. Tom put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, but kept stealing glances at the side mirror, where he could see the man's shadow behaving in ways that challenged his understanding of how light and darkness were supposed to interact. Sometimes it appeared normal, a simple silhouette cast by the desert sun, but then it would shift and twist, turning to look at Tom even when the man was staring straight ahead at the empty highway that stretched toward distant mountains. "Car breakdown?" Tom asked, making the kind of casual conversation that helped establish normal human interaction patterns while he tried to process what he was observing in his peripheral vision and mirror reflections. "Something like that." The man settled back in his seat with the relaxed posture of someone who had found relief from circumstances that had been becoming increasingly uncomfortable. He was nondescript in the way that characterized people you might encounter in any small-town diner or truck stop. Brown hair, average height, no distinguishing features that would make him memorable in normal circumstances. But his shadow writhed and twisted in the afternoon sun, stretching and contracting, independent of any movement the man made, sometimes appearing to reach toward Tom with gestures that suggested communication or warning, sometimes seeming to recoil as if it were afraid of something in the truck's interior. The disconnect between the man's calm demeanor and his shadow's agitated behavior created a tension that made Tom's hands sweat on the steering wheel. They drove through the desert landscape, past Joshua trees and red rock formations that had been shaped by millions of years of wind and weather into sculptures that seemed to belong to another planet. Tom kept stealing glances at his passenger shadow, trying to understand what he was seeing, searching for some rational explanation that would make the impossible seem merely unusual. Sometimes the shadow appeared normal, behaving according to expected optical principles, but then it would shift dramatically, turning to look at Tom even when the man was staring straight ahead through the windshield at the empty road. The shadow seemed to have its own awareness, its own agenda, its own relationship with the world that existed independently of the man who was supposed to be casting it. "You from around here?" Tom asked, hoping that normal conversation might somehow anchor them both in the practical world of geography and personal history, might provide some framework for understanding what was happening in his truck. "Used to be, a long time ago." The man's voice carried the distant quality of someone accessing memories that required effort to retrieve clearly, suggesting that his connection to this place involved years or decades of separation. Coming back to settle some business. What kind of business? Tom's question emerged from growing curiosity about his passenger's purpose and the supernatural phenomena that seemed to surround him, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the details of business that involved shadows with independent consciousness. The man turned to look at him, and for a moment his features seemed to blur, becoming indistinct like a photograph taken through water or viewed through heat distortion that made solid objects appear to waver and shift. Family business. The phrase carried implications about obligations and relationships that transcended normal human concerns, suggesting connections that had survived whatever circumstances had brought him back to this desert location. In the passenger window, the man's shadow was pressing against the glass with both hands spread wide, as if trying to escape from some kind of invisible prison, or warn Tom about dangers that only it could perceive. Tom could see the outline clearly. Definitely humanoid in shape, but wrong somehow. In its proportions and movements, the limbs were too long, too fluid, the head tilted at an unnatural angle that suggested damage or distortion that had affected its ability to maintain normal human form. The sight made Tom's stomach clench with instinctive revulsion and fear, but he forced himself to maintain normal driving patterns and conversational tones, unwilling to acknowledge the impossibility of what he was witnessing until he could better understand what he was dealing with. "You okay?" Tom asked, his voice carrying forced casualness that barely concealed his growing anxiety. "You look a little pale." "I run a little hot. Always have." The man smiled, and for just a moment Tom saw flames behind his eyes. Not metaphorical heat, but actual fire that flickered and danced as if his skull contained a furnace rather than normal human consciousness. The effect lasted only seconds, but it was long enough to confirm that whatever was sitting beside him operated according to principles that transcended normal biological functions. They passed through small desert towns, Fallon, Fernley, places where the heat shimmered off the pavement and made everything look fluid, where the boundary between reality and mirage became blurred by atmospheric conditions that could make the impossible seem merely unusual. The man's shadow grew more agitated with each mile, sometimes appearing to move independently across the cab's interior, creeping along the dashboard and ceiling like spilled ink that followed its own rules about gravity and surface tension. As they approached Reno, the man began giving directions that seemed designed to avoid main thoroughfares and well-lit areas, preferring routes that took them through older parts of the city, where mature trees created canopies over the roads. Every turn the man suggested seemed calculated to keep them in shadow away from the bright afternoon sun that made his shadow's abnormal behavior more obvious and disturbing. "Turn here," the man said, pointing to a street lined with ancient oaks that created a tunnel of green shade, their branches interlocking overhead to filter the sunlight into patterns of light and shadow that shifted constantly as leaves moved in the desert breeze. Tom made the turn and immediately felt a chill despite the desert heat outside, as if they had entered a microclimate where different rules applied to temperature and atmospheric pressure. The man's shadow seemed to relax in the dimmer light, spreading out across the cab like liquid that had finally found a container that suited its needs. The agitation and apparent distress that had characterized its behavior in bright sunlight gave way to something that might have been contentment or relief, as if darkness provided the conditions it needed to exist comfortably. "Just a few more blocks," the man said, his voice carrying a note of anticipation that suggested they were approaching their destination and whatever resolution he sought to the business that had brought him back to this place. They pulled up in front of a modest two-story house with a wraparound porch, the kind of older residential architecture that characterized neighborhoods that had been established decades earlier when building standards and community patterns followed different principles. The man gathered himself to leave, but hesitated with his hand on the door handle, looking back at Tom with an expression that combined gratitude with something that might have been regret or warning. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone who needed to address important subjects before their time together ended. "Sure," Tom replied, though he wasn't certain he wanted to hear whatever question or revelation his passenger felt compelled to share, especially given the supernatural phenomena that had characterized their journey together. "Do you believe in guilt? Real guilt, the kind that follows you forever?" The question carried implications about responsibility and consequence that went beyond normal human concerns about mistakes and poor judgment, suggesting guilt that operated according to different timescales and consequences than those governed by legal systems or social disapproval. Tom wasn't sure how to answer that question because it seemed to touch on philosophical and spiritual territories that he hadn't spent much time exploring. concepts that belonged to categories of human experience he had been fortunate enough to avoid. "I guess everyone's got things they regret." The man nodded slowly, as if Tom's response had confirmed something he had suspected but needed to hear articulated by someone else. "Some regrets are heavier than others." "Some of them." He gestured vaguely at his shadow, which was now stretched across the entire cab, reaching toward Tom like grasping fingers that sought contact or communication. "Some of them take on a life of their own." "What did you do?" Tom asked, though he suspected the answer would involve circumstances and actions that belonged to categories of human experience he preferred not to contemplate, situations where normal moral guidelines had been abandoned in favor of choices that created permanent consequences. The man was quiet for a long moment, his silence suggesting that he was accessing memories that were difficult to retrieve or painful to acknowledge. "I killed my brother 20 years ago, right here in this house. We were fighting over our father's will, inheritance that seemed important at the time, and I pushed him down the stairs. Made it look like an accident so I could collect the money and property without legal complications." Tom felt his mouth go dry as the implications of the confession settled over him like a weight that pressed against his chest and made breathing difficult. "Why are you telling me this?" The question emerged from his growing understanding that he had become involved in something that transcended normal passenger transportation, that he was somehow participating in a process of resolution or confession that involved supernatural elements and consequences. "Because it's time." The man opened the door and stepped down from the cab, his movements carrying the finality of someone who had made decisions that couldn't be reversed or reconsidered. 20 years I've been running from what I did, but you can't outrun your shadow forever." As the man walked toward the house, Tom saw something that made his blood freeze, and his rational mind struggled to process information that violated every assumption he had about the relationship between people and the shadows they cast. The man's shadow wasn't following him, it was leading, pulling him forward like a puppet master manipulating strings, guiding him toward the house with movements that suggested the shadow possessed its own will and agenda. And in the shadow's outline, Tom could see a second figure, larger and more substantial than the first, walking behind the man with its hands on his shoulders in a gesture that might have been guidance or control. The shadow seemed to contain two distinct entities, the man himself and something else that looked angry and vengeful, something that had been waiting 20 years for this moment of confrontation and resolution. The man reached the front porch and turned back to wave at Tom, but his shadow was facing the other direction, reaching toward the house with arms that looked more like claws than hands, appendages designed for grasping and holding rather than normal human manipulation of objects. The disconnect between the man's casual farewell gesture and his shadow's predatory posture created a final image that would haunt Tom's memory for years to come. Tom drove away quickly, but in his mirrors he could see the man standing on the porch, apparently wrestling with something invisible to normal sight, but clearly present to whatever supernatural perception governed his experience. His shadow writhed and twisted around him like smoke, and for just a moment Tom thought he saw two distinct figures in the darkness. The man and something else that looked angry and vengeful, something that had been waiting 2 decades for this opportunity to exact justice or revenge. That night, Tom checked the local news websites, driven by curiosity and a need to understand the resolution of the encounter that had challenged his understanding of reality and consequence. The story was brief, but confirmed his suspicions. Local man found dead in family home. The article described how Robert Chen, 47, had been found at the bottom of the stairs in his childhood home, the same house where his brother Michael had died 20 years earlier in what had been ruled an accidental fall. Police were treating Robert's death as an accident, though neighbors reported hearing shouting and sounds of a struggle just before the body was discovered. The coincidence of two brothers dying in identical circumstances in the same location had prompted some speculation about whether the earlier death might have involved foul play, but there was no evidence to support criminal charges or further investigation. But what struck Tom most was the final paragraph of the article, which mentioned that police had noted unusual markings on the floor around the body, dark stains that appeared to form the outline of two figures, patterns that looked like shadows burned into the wooden floor with such intensity that they couldn't be removed or explained. The stains defied efforts at cleaning or identification, remaining as permanent evidence of whatever confrontation had taken place in the house. Tom never told anyone about the man with the wrong shadow, about the supernatural passenger who had needed transportation to a final confrontation with guilt that had taken physical form and developed its own agenda for justice and resolution. But sometimes, when he was driving through bright desert country, he would check his own shadow in the mirrors, making sure it was still following him in the normal way, still moving in the same direction he was traveling. Because he had learned that shadows remember everything, and that sometimes they carry grudges that outlast the flesh that casts them, developing their own consciousness and purpose that operates according to different rules about justice and consequence than those recognized by human legal systems. The desert, Tom realized, was full of people running from their shadows. But running only worked for so long before the darkness caught up and demanded a reckoning for actions that had created permanent stains on the fabric of moral reality. Years later, other drivers reported picking up hitchhikers whose shadows moved independently, reaching toward them with grasping fingers that suggested hunger for contact or communication. Passengers who were always heading home to settle old debts, with ghosts that refused to remain buried, always accompanied by dark figures that seemed to be guiding them toward some inevitable confrontation with the consequences of choices they had made decades earlier. Shadows that had developed their own agenda for justice that transcended normal human timelines and legal procedures. The desert night was full of such travelers, Tom learned. People whose guilt had become so heavy that it had taken on physical form and begun to operate according to its own rules about responsibility and resolution, creating supernatural consequences that couldn't be escaped through geographical relocation or the simple passage of time. Story 11. The Night Messenger. Elena had been driving the midnight shift for 5 years, navigating the empty highways that connected major medical centers and pharmaceutical distribution points across a network that operated around the clock to ensure that critical medications reached the people who needed them. But she'd never seen anything like the woman standing at the bus stop on Highway 287 at 3 a.m., when the road should have been empty except for the occasional long-haul trucker and the distant lights of towns that never completely slept. It was the kind of hour when the world belonged to shift workers and emergency responders, people whose schedules operated according to different rhythms than the normal patterns of human activity. The woman stood alone beside a rural bus stop that was 40 miles from the nearest town, wearing a nurse's uniform that was pristine white despite the late hour and the dusty conditions that characterized this stretch of Texas highway. Her white shoes were bright against the dark asphalt, and everything about her appearance suggested professional competence and medical authority. But there was no logical explanation for why a nurse would be waiting for public transportation in the middle of nowhere during the deepest hours of the night. Elena pulled her medical supply truck over and rolled down the window, driven by the same sense of professional responsibility that connected all the people who worked in healthcare and emergency services, the understanding that medical personnel looked out for each other regardless of circumstances or institutional affiliations. "You need help, miss?" The woman approached Elena's truck with movements that seemed both urgent and controlled, carrying herself with the purposeful stride of someone who was dealing with an emergency situation that required immediate attention and professional expertise. She was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and tired eyes that seemed older than her face. eyes that held the kind of exhaustion that came from too many double shifts, and too many situations where human life had depended on decisions made under pressure. Her uniform was perfect, not a wrinkle or stain despite the late hour and the isolated location where Elena had found her. Fabric that looked freshly laundered and pressed, as if she had just begun her shift rather than been stranded beside a highway for an unknown period of time. The perfection of her appearance was almost unsettling, suggesting either superhuman attention to personal grooming or circumstances that didn't follow normal rules about how clothing responded to time and environmental conditions. "I need to get to St. Mary's Hospital," the woman said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled urgency that characterized medical professionals dealing with life-threatening situations. "It's an emergency." Elena knew St. Mary's, a regional medical center about 60 miles north that served as the primary trauma facility for a large area of rural Texas, the kind of hospital that received the most serious cases and handled emergencies that smaller facilities couldn't manage. "What kind of emergency? Do you need me to call someone?" Elena asked, her own medical training prompting her to assess the situation and determine what kind of assistance might be most appropriate under circumstances that seemed to involve professional rather than personal crisis. "No time for calls." The woman's voice carried a strange urgency that seemed to transcend normal emergency protocols, suggesting that whatever was happening at St. Mary's required immediate physical presence rather than coordination through normal communication channels. "People are dying. I have to get there now." She climbed into the passenger seat with movements that combined efficiency with desperation, and Elena noticed that she carried no purse, no bag, no personal belongings except for a small glass vial filled with clear liquid that she clutched carefully in both hands, as if it contained something more precious than diamonds or gold. The vial seemed to be the focus of all her attention and concern, the object that justified her presence on this empty highway and her desperate need to reach the hospital. "I'm Elena," she said, pulling back onto the highway and beginning the journey north toward St. Mary's, through territory that was mostly empty farmland and small communities that closed down completely after sunset, leaving only the highway as a connection between distant points of light. Sarah Martinez." The woman's introduction was brief, delivered without the elaboration or personal details that normally characterize conversations between strangers who found themselves sharing transportation during long nighttime journeys. "I'm a nurse at St. Mary's. There's been an outbreak, some kind of poisoning. This is the antidote." Elena glanced at the vial, noting how Sarah held it with the kind of careful attention that medical professionals reserve for substances that could mean the difference between life and death. Shouldn't that go through proper channels? EMT services? Hazmat protocols? The questions emerged from Elena's own experience with medical supply chains and emergency response procedures, systems that had been developed to ensure that critical medications reached patients safely and efficiently. No time. Sarah's knuckles were white as she gripped the vial, her entire body tense with the kind of stress that came from bearing responsibility for other people's lives under impossible time constraints. "Children are dying. I have to get this to Dr. Harrison before it's too late." They drove through the Texas Hill Country, past dark ranches and sleeping towns where the only lights came from emergency services and the occasional all-night business that served travelers and shift workers. Sarah sat perfectly still, never relaxing her hold on the vial, never acknowledging the landscape rolling past outside the windows. Her attention was completely focused on protecting the medication she carried and reaching her destination before whatever emergency she was responding to progressed beyond the point where intervention would be effective. Elena tried to make conversation, partly from natural sociability, and partly from growing curiosity about the circumstances that had brought a nurse to a remote bus stop with life-saving medication. But Sarah seemed consumed by her mission, focused entirely on the medical emergency that required her immediate attention. "How many children?" Elena asked, making the kind of inquiry that one medical professional might make to another when discussing case details and treatment priorities. 17 so far. They were at a birthday party, ate something contaminated. The symptoms. Sarah's voice trailed off, and Elena could see in her expression the kind of horror that medical professionals experience when confronting conditions that exceeded their training and challenged their ability to provide effective treatment. "I have never seen anything like it." Elena's phone had signal in this area, and she considered calling ahead to the hospital to verify the emergency and coordinate their arrival. But something in Sarah's expression stopped her from making the call. The woman looked haunted, desperate in a way that seemed to go beyond normal professional concern for patients, carrying a burden that transcended the usual weight of medical responsibility and suggested personal involvement that made the situation more complex than a simple response to institutional emergency. As they approached the outskirts of the city where St. Mary's was located, Sarah began giving specific directions that bypassed the main entrance and led toward the employee parking area behind the hospital. She seemed to know the layout perfectly, directing Elena through a maze of service roads and loading areas with the confidence of someone who had navigated these routes countless times under various circumstances and conditions. "Here," Sarah said, pointing to a loading dock that was dimly lit and apparently unmonitored at this hour of the night. "This is the fastest way." Elena pulled up to the dock, and Sarah gathered herself to leave with movements that had become increasingly urgent as they approached their destination. But as she opened the door, Elena caught sight of something that made her heart skip, and her understanding of the situation shift dramatically. The vial in Sarah's hands was empty. Not half empty or nearly depleted, but completely empty, as if it had never contained anything at all. The glass was clear and clean, showing no residue or indication that it had ever held the life-saving medication that Sarah claimed to be delivering to dying children. "Sarah?" Elena said carefully, her voice carrying the gentle tone that medical professionals used when dealing with patients who might be experiencing psychological crisis or delusional episodes. "The vial." Sarah looked down at her hands and smiled with an expression that combined sadness with something that might have been acceptance or resignation. "I know. It's been empty for a long time. But I have to keep trying. I have to keep bringing it here." The admission revealed the true nature of her situation, acknowledging that whatever mission had driven her to seek transportation was based on need, rather than practical medical intervention. She climbed down from the truck and walked toward the loading dock with steps that made no sound on the concrete surface, moving with the kind of silence that characterized people who existed outside normal physical laws and material constraints. At the service entrance, she simply walked through the locked door, disappearing into the hospital like mist or memory, leaving no trace of her passage except the lingering impression of professional dedication and personal tragedy. Elena sat in her truck for several minutes, trying to process what she had witnessed and understand her role in facilitating a journey that apparently involved supernatural rather than practical medical intervention. Then she pulled out her phone and called St. Mary's main number, driven by curiosity and a need to verify the reality of the emergency that Sarah claimed to be addressing. The night operator sounded tired but alert, her voice carrying the professional competence that characterized hospital staff who dealt with emergencies and crisis situations as routine parts of their work environment. "St. Mary's Hospital, how can I help you?" "I need to check on something," Elena said, choosing her words carefully to avoid sounding either crazy or intrusive. "Is there a nurse named Sarah Martinez working there?" "Let me check our directory," the operator replied, and Elena could hear the familiar sound of computer keys as personnel records were accessed and searched. "I'm sorry, we don't have anyone by that name currently employed here." "What about recently? Maybe she just left," Elena persisted, hoping to find some connection between the woman she had transported and the hospital that had been her claimed destination. "Hold on." A longer pause suggested more extensive database searching. "I'm showing a Sarah Martinez who worked here, but that was 8 years ago." The information confirmed Elena's growing suspicion that she had been involved in something that transcended normal timelines and employment relationships. Elena felt cold despite the warm night air that flowed through her truck's ventilation system. What happened to her? The question emerged from her need to understand the complete story and the circumstances that had led to Sarah's supernatural journey to the hospital. I really shouldn't discuss personnel matters, but since it's public record, the operator's voice carried the careful tone of someone who wanted to be helpful while respecting institutional policies and privacy considerations. She died in a car accident on Highway 287. She was rushing to the hospital during a medical emergency, trying to bring some kind of experimental treatment for sick children. Never made it. Elena's hands were shaking as she absorbed the implications of what she was learning. What kind of emergency? Food poisoning outbreak at a children's birthday party, 17 kids affected. The details matched exactly what Sarah had told her during their journey together, confirming that the emergency had been real, even if Sarah's ability to respond to it had been interrupted by circumstances beyond her control. By the time other medical personnel arrived with proper treatment, it was too late. All 17 children died that night. Elena thanked the operator and hung up, sitting in the hospital parking lot while she tried to understand what she had experienced and what it meant about the persistence of professional obligation and personal guilt beyond normal biological constraints. She looked back at the hospital building, searching the windows for any sign of the supernatural nurse who had needed transportation to complete a mission that had been interrupted 8 years earlier. In one of the upper floor windows, she thought she saw a figure in white, a nurse moving through corridors that should have been dimly lit and mostly empty at this hour, still trying to deliver medicine that had arrived too late to save the children who had depended on her professional expertise and dedication. The figure moved with purpose and determination, carrying an empty vial that represented hope rather than actual pharmaceutical intervention. Over the following months, Elena heard similar stories from other drivers who traveled Highway 287 during the midnight hours. Encounters with a nurse who needed transportation to St. Mary's Hospital, always carrying an empty vial, always 8 years too late to save the children who had died while she was rushing to help them. The encounters followed a consistent pattern. Drivers would pick up Sarah Martinez at various points along the highway, transport her toward the hospital, and discover only afterward that they had been assisting someone who had died years earlier while attempting the same journey. The thing about guilt, Elena learned, was that it could trap a soul just as effectively as any physical prison, creating obligations that persisted beyond normal biological constraints and continued long after the circumstances that had created them had passed into history. Sarah Martinez had died trying to save those children, but in her mind, she had failed them by not arriving in time with the treatment they needed. So she kept trying, night after night, year after year, carrying hope in an empty vial and seeking transportation from drivers who were willing to believe in voices that came from empty air and missions that transcended normal timelines and medical protocols. Some dedication was too strong to be interrupted by death. Some professional obligations too important to abandon, even when fulfilling them had become impossible through normal means. Elena never drove Highway 287 again after midnight. But sometimes she would think about Sarah, still traveling that dark road with her useless medicine, still believing that this time would be different, that this journey would arrive in time to save lives that had been lost 8 years earlier. Some people were too good to accept that they couldn't save everyone, too dedicated to acknowledge that some failures were beyond their control or correction. The road was full of unfinished business and unpaid debts, Elena realized. But some of those debts belonged to the universe rather than the individuals who carried them, and some business would remain unfinished, no matter how many times people tried to complete it. Sarah Martinez would keep making her journey, until she learned to forgive herself for arriving too late, until she understood that some tragedies were beyond human prevention, and that her dedication was more important than her success or failure in any particular case. Story 12. The Collector. Marcus first saw the old woman at a rest stop outside Amarillo, sitting on a weathered wooden bench with what looked like a large canvas bag beside her. and there was something about her stillness that made him uneasy, even from a distance. She was tiny, maybe 80 years old, with silver hair that caught the afternoon light, and a face mapped with wrinkles that spoke of decades of sun and weather and experiences that had left their marks in the geography of her skin. But her eyes were sharp and alert, watching the trucks that came and went with the kind of predatory interest that hunters showed when studying potential prey, cataloging each vehicle and driver with an attention to detail that seemed disproportionate to casual observation. When she raised her thumb as Marcus pulled out of the parking lot, something about her made him stop, despite every instinct that told him to keep driving and avoid whatever situation was developing at this remote rest area. Maybe it was the way she smiled, too wide, showing teeth that seemed too white and too perfect for someone her age, creating an expression that promised friendliness but delivered something else entirely, something that belonged to categories of human interaction that operated according to different rules about kindness and assistance. "Need a ride, ma'am?" Marcus called through the passenger window, his voice carrying the automatic courtesy that characterized interactions between strangers in highway settings, though he was already beginning to regret his decision to stop and involve himself in circumstances that felt wrong in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. "Oh, bless you, dear." Her voice was sweet, grandmotherly, carrying the kind of gentle warmth that suggested homemade cookies and comfortable rocking chairs and stories told to attentive children gathered around kitchen tables. "I need to get to Oklahoma City. Family business." She climbed into the cab with surprising agility for someone her age, moving with the kind of fluid grace that suggested either excellent physical conditioning or something that transcended normal human limitations related to aging and mobility. She pulled the canvas bag up with her, and Marcus could tell by the way she handled it that it was heavier than it looked, requiring careful attention to balance and positioning that suggested its contents were both valuable and fragile. The bag itself was old, made of thick canvas that had been darkened by years of use and exposure to weather, with reinforced seams that indicated it had been designed to carry substantial weight over long distances. "What's in the bag?" Marcus asked as they pulled back onto I-40, heading east through the Texas Panhandle toward Oklahoma. His curiosity driven partly by normal conversational interest and partly by growing unease about his passenger and the circumstances that had brought them together. "Just some things I collect." The old woman, she'd introduced herself as Eunice during the brief process of settling into the passenger seat, positioned the bag carefully between her feet with movements that suggested its contents required specific handling and protection. "I've been collecting for a very long time." Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had developed expertise in a particular area of interest, though the nature of her collection remained mysteriously undefined. Marcus nodded and focused on the road, trying to establish normal conversational patterns while monitoring his growing sense that something about Eunice didn't fit standard categories of elderly passengers who needed transportation assistance. She was pleasant enough, chatting about the weather and the countryside in the kind of casual manner that characterized small talk between strangers, asking polite questions about his route and his family that seemed designed to establish rapport and gather information about his circumstances and schedule. But he noticed she never let go of the bag, always keeping one hand resting on its top, as if maintaining physical contact was necessary to ensure the security of whatever was inside. Her attention to the bag's welfare seemed to exceed normal concern for personal belongings, suggesting that its contents represented something more important than simple travel necessities or sentimental items that elderly people often carried during long journeys. After an hour of driving through the flat landscape of the Texas Panhandle, Marcus caught a smell that made his nose wrinkle and his stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. It was something organic and unpleasant, like meat that had been left in the sun too long, a sweetness that suggested decomposition and biological processes that should have been interrupted by proper refrigeration or preservation techniques. The odor seemed to be emanating from the canvas bag, though Eunice showed no sign of noticing the increasingly offensive smell that was beginning to fill the cab. "You smell that?" Marcus asked, hoping that acknowledging the odor might prompt some explanation or lead to actions that would address whatever was causing the unpleasant atmosphere in his truck. Eunice's expression didn't change, maintaining the same pleasant demeanor that had characterized her interaction since she had climbed into the cab. "Smell what, dear?" Her response suggested either genuine inability to detect the odor that was becoming increasingly prominent, or deliberate denial of something she preferred not to acknowledge or discuss. The smell was getting stronger with each mile, filling the cab with a cloying sweetness that made Marcus want to breathe through his mouth and roll down the windows despite the heat outside. It seemed to be coming directly from the canvas bag, though Eunice continued to show no awareness of the offensive emanations that were making highway travel increasingly unpleasant and potentially unbearable. "Maybe we should crack a window," Marcus suggested, hoping that fresh air circulation might dilute whatever was causing the problematic atmosphere, without requiring direct confrontation about the source of the smell. "If you think that's best." Eunice's tone remained agreeable and accommodating, but her grip on the bag tightened noticeably, her knuckles becoming white with the effort of maintaining her hold on whatever was inside. The increased tension in her posture suggested that opening windows represented some kind of threat or complication to her plans, though she was unwilling to explicitly object to his suggestion. They drove through the Oklahoma Panhandle, past wheat fields and cattle ranches that stretched toward distant horizons under an enormous sky that seemed to dwarf human activities and make individual concerns seem insignificant in the context of geological time and cosmic scale. The smell continued to worsen, and Marcus found himself breathing through his mouth in an attempt to minimize his exposure to whatever biological processes were taking place inside Eunice's carefully guarded canvas bag. But what bothered him more than the offensive odor was the way the bag seemed to be moving, showing subtle shifts and adjustments that suggested something inside was settling or rearranging itself according to its own agenda and preferences. The movement was irregular and unpredictable, sometimes causing the bag to bulge slightly in one direction or another, sometimes creating sounds like rustling or shifting that seemed to come from multiple sources within the canvas container. I'm sorry, what was your last name?" Marcus asked, realizing that despite having traveled together for more than an hour, he knew very little about his passenger beyond her first name and her destination in Oklahoma City. "Just call me Eunice, dear." Her smile was constant now, never wavering or changing intensity, maintaining the same expression of benevolent friendliness that had characterized their interaction since the beginning of their journey. "Tell me, do you have children?" The question seemed to represent a change of subject, moving away from personal identification toward topics that might reveal information about Marcus's family circumstances and domestic situation. "Two boys, 8 and 10, Marcus answered automatically, though something about Eunice's interest in his children made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't immediately identify, creating an instinctive wariness that suggested parental protective instincts responding to potential threats. How wonderful! Boys are so energetic at that age, so full of life. She paused, stroking the top of the bag with one gnarled finger in a gesture that seemed both affectionate and possessive. "I love children. I've been collecting them for years." The statement was delivered in the same sweet, conversational tone that had characterized all of her previous comments, but the content created implications that made Marcus's blood run cold. Something in her tone made Marcus look at her more carefully, studying her expression and posture for signs that might reveal her true intentions or the nature of her interest in children. Her eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to go beyond normal conversational engagement, cataloging details about his appearance and responses with a kind of systematic attention that suggested she was gathering information for purposes that extended beyond casual social interaction. And her hand on the bag was moving in small circles, creating patterns that looked like she was petting something, that required comfort or reassurance, stroking whatever was inside with the kind of gentle attention that people normally reserved for beloved pets or precious possessions that needed careful handling and protection. "Collecting them?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a note of confusion that was rapidly evolving into concern and apprehension as the implications of her statement began to register in his conscious awareness. "Oh, yes, wherever I find them. Bus stops, playgrounds, sometimes just walking along the road by themselves." Eunice's voice remained sweet and conversational, as if she were discussing a hobby that involved stamps or coins, rather than activities that had implications for child safety and welfare. "Children are so trusting, so easy to collect." Marcus felt his hands tighten on the wheel as her words created images and possibilities that violated every assumption he had about normal human behavior, and the boundaries that separated acceptable social interaction from criminal activity. "What do you mean, collect?" Eunice turned to look at him fully, and her smile widened until it seemed to split her face in ways that challenged normal human facial anatomy, creating an expression that revealed far too many teeth and suggested dental structure that didn't conform to standard patterns of human dentition. "Would you like to see?" Before Marcus could answer or object, she began to open the canvas bag, and the smell that emerged was overwhelming. A combination of rot and sweetness and something chemical that burned his nostrils and made his eyes water. But it was what he saw inside that made him slam on the brakes and fight to maintain control of his truck as his understanding of reality shifted dramatically and horribly. Small objects, dozens of them, nestled in what looked like cotton batting that might once have been white but had become stained and discolored by whatever preservation processes had been applied to the bag's contents. At first glance, they might have been dolls or toys, miniature figures arranged with care and attention to detail, but Marcus's mind refused to process what he was actually seeing, what Eunice was showing him with the pride of a collector displaying her most prized possession. Tiny forms, perfectly preserved, with faces frozen in expressions of surprise or fear that suggested their final moments had been characterized by terror and confusion rather than peaceful transition. The preservation was unnaturally perfect, maintaining details and coloration that should have been lost to normal biological processes, creating the impression that whatever had happened to them had occurred recently, despite evidence that some of the figures had been part of the collection for extended periods. "I keep them forever," Eunice said, her voice no longer sweet but cold and clinical, carrying the detached tone of someone who had moved beyond normal human emotional responses into territories where conventional morality and ethical constraints no longer applied. "They never grow up, never change, always exactly as they were when I found them." Marcus pulled over to the shoulder of the highway, his heart hammering with a combination of terror and revulsion that made coherent thought difficult and rational response nearly impossible. "What are you?" "I'm a collector." Eunice reached into the bag and lifted out one of the small forms, cradling it like a beloved pet or treasured possession that required gentle handling and careful attention. "I've been collecting for over a century. Children are my specialty, but I'm not particular. Sometimes I collect truck drivers." She looked at Marcus with those sharp eyes that had seemed merely alert when he first encountered her, but now revealed something inhuman and predatory, something old and hungry and patient that had learned to disguise itself as harmless elderly femininity while pursuing an agenda that transcended normal human motivations and constraints. "The thing about collections," Eunice continued, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had achieved expertise in a particular area of interest, "is that they're never really complete. There's always room for one more. Her statement carried implications about Marcus's immediate future that made his survival instincts scream warnings about danger that extended beyond simple criminal activity into territories where normal defensive strategies might prove inadequate. Marcus grabbed for the door handle, driven by primitive fight-or-flight responses that recognized threats to survival and demanded immediate action. But Eunice moved faster than any 80-year-old should have been able to, her hand closing on his wrist with inhuman strength that suggested physical capabilities that transcended normal geriatric limitations. Her touch was cold as winter ground, carrying sensations that seemed to bypass normal nerve pathways and create impressions of ice and death that penetrated to bone level. "Don't be difficult, dear," she said, her voice returning to the sweet grandmotherly tone that had characterized their early interaction, but now carrying undertones of threat and inevitability. "It won't hurt much." Marcus felt something happening to him, a creeping numbness that started where she touched him and spread up his arm like frost forming on glass, and he looked down to see his hand beginning to shrink, the skin taking on a waxy, artificial appearance that suggested transformation was already underway. With his free hand, he grabbed the CB radio and keyed the microphone, broadcasting an emergency call that he hoped would bring assistance or at least create witnesses to whatever was happening in his truck. "Mayday! Mayday! I-40 eastbound, mile marker 142. Help me!" The transmission represented his last hope for intervention from the normal world of highway safety and emergency response. Authorities who operated according to conventional understanding of criminal activity and appropriate protective measures. Eunice frowned, with the annoyed expression of someone whose carefully planned activities had been disrupted by unexpected complications. "That was rude." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small glass vial filled with clear liquid that might have been water or might have been something designed to facilitate the preservation processes that maintained her collection in its unnaturally perfect state. "This will help you relax," she said, removing the stopper from the vial and preparing to apply whatever chemical assistance she used to make her collecting activities more manageable and less resistant to her supernatural methodology. But the radio had done its job, and in the distance Marcus could hear sirens approaching from multiple directions, the sound of emergency vehicles responding to his distress call with the speed and efficiency that characterized highway patrol and emergency medical services. Eunice heard them too, and her expression turned annoyed rather than concern, suggesting that law enforcement represented inconvenience rather than serious threat to her activity. "Well, that's inconvenient." She released his wrist and began packing her collection back into the bag, with the careful attention to detail that characterized someone who had performed the same actions countless times under various circumstances. "I suppose we'll have to continue this another time." She opened the passenger door and climbed down from the truck with movements that had regained their apparent elderly frailty, shouldering the heavy bag with ease that contradicted her apparent physical limitations. "Thank you for the ride, dear, and don't worry, I'll find you again. I always find the ones that get away." She walked away from the truck with steps that became increasingly insubstantial with distance, and Marcus watched in horror as she simply vanished, fading like mist in the afternoon sun until there was no evidence that she had ever existed except for the lingering smell of decay and preservatives that would require professional cleaning to completely eliminate from his truck's interior. By the time the state police arrived, responding to his emergency transmission with multiple units and a coordinated approach that suggested they took distress calls from truckers seriously, there was no sign of Eunice, except for the offensive odor that served as evidence of her presence and the supernatural encounter that had challenged Marcus's understanding of what was possible in the normal world of highway transportation. Marcus's hand returned to normal over the following hours, the transformation reversing itself as if Eunice's influence required continuous contact to maintain its effects. But he never forgot the feeling of that cold touch, or the sight of her impossible collection. He tried to report what had happened to the investigating officers, but they found no evidence of an elderly woman matching his description. no witnesses who had seen anyone fitting Eunice's appearance at the rest stop where he had picked her up. What they did find, when they searched missing persons databases at Marcus's request, was a pattern that extended back decades. Children who had vanished from truck stops and rest areas along major highways, disappearances that followed consistent patterns and were often associated with witness reports of elderly women carrying large bags and showing unusual interest in unaccompanied minors. The investigators told Marcus he was lucky that most people who encountered Eunice never got the chance to call for help or escape from whatever process she used to add new specimens to her collection. But Marcus didn't feel lucky. He felt marked, chosen for inclusion in a collection that operated according to different rules about possession and ownership than those recognized by normal human society. Because sometimes, late at night when he was driving empty highways, he would see her in his mirrors, standing at distant truck stops, waiting patiently beside her canvas bag, with the eternal patience of someone who understood that collecting was a long-term pursuit that required persistence and dedication. Still collecting, still looking for additions to a museum of preserved childhood that existed outside normal categories of time and biological process. And he knew that someday, when his guard was down or his luck ran out, she would finish what she'd started, because collectors never liked to leave their work incomplete. And Eunice had been perfecting her methods for over a century, learning to be patient with specimens that required extended pursuit and careful planning before they could be properly added to her ever-growing display of perfectly preserved humanity.